By the 1st century AD, Campania was losing its former role as a creative center for Italic Hellenistic architectural innovation, a role it had held for the last 2 centuries of the Republic. The ruins of cities buried in the eruption of 79 AD don't fully reflect the richness of early imperial monuments once found in the region. Coastal villas will be discussed separately. Here, we'll look briefly at just a few important buildings. Pompeii had the oldest known fully stone-built amphitheater, but Campania also had 2 of the largest and best preserved later examples. One was at Capua, measuring 170 by 139 meters, second in size only to the Colosseum. The other was at Pozzuoli, measuring 149 by 116 meters. The Capua amphitheater probably dated from the late Julio-Claudian era and was renovated under Hadrian, while the Pozzuoli one belonged to the Flavian period. These 2 buildings can be compared to the amphitheater in Verona. All early amphitheaters in Italy were either partially dug into the ground, with only the upper parts above the surface, like those in Sutri, Lucera, Syracuse, Terni, and Merida in Spain, or built of wood on stone foundations, as in northern Italy and likely in early Rome. With the construction of the Colosseum and these 4 large amphitheaters, the design reached its most advanced stage. The amphitheater in Pozzuoli stands out for its high-quality brick and stone masonry. Only the outer ring, now mostly stripped of stone, was built from solid blocks. The underground parts and service corridors are well preserved, with visible systems like elevators used to bring wild animals into the arena. Verona's amphitheater has survived thanks to a public foundation established in the 13th century to pay for its upkeep, an early sign of civic awareness. Structurally, it is very similar to the Colosseum. Its frame is made mostly of dressed stone, with concrete playing a smaller supporting role. The uppermost arches in the facade did not open onto a gallery, but instead provided window openings above the seating area. The same is true for Pola, where the upper levels have rectangular windows instead of arches. In Verona and Pola, pilasters appear only on the lower 2 stories and are very shallow, emphasizing the rhythm of the arches rather than traditional column designs. This is the opposite of what we see in Nimes and Arles, where pilasters and entablatures were more pronounced, creating a stronger classical effect. The Italian approach, by contrast, shows the emerging influence of concrete-based architecture with a simpler, more functional style. The Metellum at Pozzuoli is a successful, later version of the market type seen in Pompeii. It features columns made of imported granite and Charistos marble. A 38-meter square stone-paved courtyard sits at the center, surrounded by colonnades. Shops opened both onto the courtyard and the surrounding streets. On the east side, 4 large columns broke the colonnade, creating a temple front with a pediment, likely dedicated to the market's protective deity. Public toilets were located in the eastern corners. This blending of temple and colonnade in a single facade resembles the Temple of Peace, built by Vespasian in Rome, and may have been inspired by earlier Campanian models. Only a few of the luxurious villas that once made Baiae famous still survive. However, the remains of hillside bath complexes above the modern village are better preserved. One of them, with impressive terraces climbing up the slope, is still visible today. There are 4 circular halls in the area, built around thermal springs. These structures were a specialty of Baiae's architecture. The oldest of these halls is called the Temple of Mercury. It has a round interior space with a stone drum base, topped by a dome with a central oculus. 4 square windows along the curve of the dome let in light. The circular base, now filled with soil, once held a round pool and measures 21.55 meters in diameter. Inside, The walls have a repeating pattern of 4 small apse-like niches and alternating large and small rectangular openings. This design likely drew from the smaller circular rooms in early Pompeian bathhouses. The adjacent rooms, built into the hillside for support, also resemble Pompeian baths. The building features early stonework in a net-like pattern. In the dome, materials were placed in a radial pattern, as seen in the Roman Republic period. The dome's thickness gradually narrows to just 60 centimeters at the top. Its inner surface is decorated with mosaic. This dome construction might have been a deliberate use of old techniques to make the structure stronger. In any case, the building cannot be later than the early Julio-Claudian period. It represents a highly impressive architectural achievement for such an early time. The Temple of Mercury, located in Baiae, is a very clear example of a building type that developed in Campania before it was adopted by Roman architects. It is clearly a predecessor to later buildings like the Rotunda at Albano from the Domitian period, and eventually Hadrian's Pantheon. The development of this architectural form can be traced in other Campanian temples, such as the temples of Diana and Venus, probably from the 2nd century, and the Temple of Apollo near Lake Avernus. The Temple of Diana is mostly buried today, but its upper structure shows an octagonal plan. There are 8 large windows at the base of the dome. Inside, below the windows, are alternating apses, rectangular recesses, and doorways. The dome itself, with a diameter of 29.5 meters, is plain and undecorated. The Temple of Venus has a taller octagonal drum with visible buttresses at the outer corners. Its dome, 26.3 meters wide, is similar in shape to the semi-dome at Hadrian's Canopus in his villa. The surface is made up of alternating 8 concave, melon-shaped segments and 8 narrow flat sections. Small balconies line the window levels both inside and out. The Temple of Apollo, near Lake Avernus, is the largest of the 3. It sits on an octagonal base that supports a circular drum. Its diameter is only about 6 meters smaller than the Pantheon or St. Peter's Basilica. Peter's Basilica, yet it has windows in the drum, making it especially notable. Another well-represented building type in Campania is the tomb. Various kinds of tombs exist around Capua, outside the gates of Pompeii, and elsewhere. Although individual styles vary widely and personal taste makes analysis difficult, as in the Pyramid of Cestius in Rome, we can still identify clear patterns in tomb development. 2 types stand out. The first is a simple circular drum placed on a square platform. A classic example is the Mausoleum of Caecilia Metella on the Via Appia. The second type is represented by the Mausoleum at Saint-Rémy, Glanum, in Provence. This tower-like structure ends in a pyramidal or conical roof with an open pavilion or canopy at the top. The first type is an Italian invention from the 1st century BC. Wherever similar tombs are found, such as in Adamclissi in Dobruja, Attaleia in Pamphylia, or near Tidus in North Africa, they are directly or indirectly influenced by Italy. The second type has more complex roots, connected on one side to the mausoleum at Halicarnassus and on the other to Syrian tower tombs. It became widespread in Italy and the West, and later developed unique forms, such as the needle-like tower tombs in Africa. Tomb styles in Campania mostly evolved from the first type. Early tombs used simple decorations to emphasize their architectural shape. Over time, these designs became more complex, mixing elements from tower tombs, like the tomb of the Istacidi in Pompeii, columbaria, and exedra-style tombs. Some good examples of this type are the mausoleums near Marano and Pozzuoli, where the square bases are divided by pilasters into panels. The tomb known as Carceri Vecchie near Capua has detailed corner moldings and niches that recall the Mausoleum of Augustus or the Tomb of the Plauti. Among the more decorative, later examples are the tomb on the Via Celle near Pozzuoli, which looks almost like a building by Borromini, and the unusual La Conocchia tomb near Capua. Our knowledge of Roman architecture in northern Italy is limited, mostly because there are no large excavation sites like Pompeii or Ostia in the region. A major city like Aquileia, which could serve as a key to understanding archaeology in the northern Adriatic and Danube areas, has not been properly studied at that scale. So far, only scattered buildings, some cemeteries, and a few remains of the river port have been uncovered. Velleia is too small and remote to offer a strong picture of northern architecture. Most of what we know comes from random discoveries and a few surviving structures. An even greater gap is the lack of surviving buildings from the Republican period. This is significant because Rome developed many urban and architectural practices in northern Italy that it later spread to the rest of the empire. Especially in the towns of Cisalpine Gaul, Rome tested and perfected urban planning and building types. These early models helped kickstart city development across Gaul and the West. Traces of this can be seen in Aosta, Brixia, and Velleia, though much evidence lies buried under modern cities, lost forever. In Tuscany and Umbria, the Romans still interacted with people similar to themselves. But after crossing the Apennines, things changed. Most of the Po Valley was inhabited by Celts, related to those living in today's France and Central Europe. Until AD 42, this region was officially called Gallia Cisalpina. Just like in Gaul later, the urban planning model developed in central Italy found fertile ground here. By Augustus's time, nearly all of the region, except the Alps, was fully Romanized. Poets like Virgil from Mantua, Livy from Pavia, and Catullus from Verona came from here. Even with such early and deep Romanization, northern Italy remained culturally and geographically connected to the provinces beyond the Alps throughout the Roman Empire. Over time, these connections helped shape the direction of late Roman architecture. When we look at Augustan architecture, we find more surviving remains in the Alpine foothills than in the flatlands. One key example is the monument at La Turbie above Monte Carlo, built in 6 BC to mark Augustus's conquest of Alpine tribes. It featured a large cylindrical drum with 24 niches framed by 24 Tuscan columns. The whole structure sat on a square base and was topped with a cone-shaped crown. This design is a grander version of tomb monuments like the Mausoleum of Cassilia Metella on the Via Appia. By simply enlarging the basic idea, this architectural form became very suitable for imperial monuments. If accurately restored, La Turbie would show how ancient architects used simple ratios, like 4 Roman feet, to scale up buildings impressively. Another example is the arch at Susa, built 2 years earlier by those same Alpine tribes in honor of Augustus. It's a simple structure with 3/4 columns on all 4 corners, topped by a flat entablature. The arch is framed with shallow pilasters and moldings. The capitals used are typical of northern Republican colonies, though the overall design belongs to the early imperial style. The frieze has lively and somewhat naive carvings, probably done by a local artist unfamiliar with such subjects. Despite its flaws, the Susa arch shows the realism and energy typical of northern Italian art at the time. Similar traits are found in Aosta, Augusta Praetoria, founded in 24 BC as the last Roman military colony in Italy. It has preserved its Roman identity and architecture very well. Located at the crossroads of important Alpine routes, the city has a rectangular street grid with 16 equal blocks, each about 180 by 140 meters. Most blocks are divided into 4 parts. The city walls also follow a rectangular layout. This grid plan was common in Roman urban design, but the orderly layout of both streets and walls, also seen in Augusta Taurinorum, modern Turin, reflects military planning of the time. In Aosta, several buildings from the Augustan period still survive: city walls and gates, a triumphal arch, a theater, an amphitheater, and the remains of a temple surrounded by twin porticos. This temple layout is very similar to the cryptoporticus at Arles, which will be discussed later. The gates follow a common model seen in Italy and Gaul. Each has an arched opening and an upper gallery, flanked by projecting towers and opening into a rectangular courtyard. In this case, the towers are square, and the main road for vehicles is flanked by 2 pedestrian paths. The triumphal arch mentioned here was built in a rather clumsy way. The archway was squeezed between the inner pair of 4 half columns on the front. These columns stood on a continuous base that ran across the entire facade, even cutting through the pilasters of the arch. The upper part no longer survives, but the structure followed a mixed Doric-Ionic order. This blend came from Hellenistic traditions and had already been abandoned early by architects in central Italy under Augustus. The capitals of the pilasters resemble those from the Republican period, like in the arch at Susa. Not much can be said about the amphitheater. The masonry work looks strong, but somewhat rough, similar to that of the theater. The theater, however, stands out. Its seating area, or cavea, was built inside a rectangular outer frame. On the street side, it had large buttresses and rows of arches and windows. This design focused more on strength than aesthetics. A shallow, curved niche around the central doorway in the stage building is similar to the theater at Arles and suggests the same architectural phase. Some scholars believe it might have been an Odeon, a covered concert hall, rather than an open-air theater. The Porta Palatina in Turin was mainly made of brick and followed the same structure as the gate in Aosta, but with more decoration. This gate had 2 passages for carts, hexagonal towers, and an upper gallery. The pilasters and cornices were repeated twice. These were decorative variations of the same basic design. Other cities had different tower shapes. Como and Avenches, in Roman Aventicum from the Flavian period, had octagonal towers. Spello's Porta Venera had 10-sided towers. Asti had hexagonal ones, and Milan's Torre di Ansperto had 24 sides. In places like Fano, built around AD 9 to 10, Nimes and Autun, towers were rectangular with rounded fronts. Circular towers were rare, but some gates with recessed forecourts, as in Arles, Frejus, and Vindonissa, included such towers. The most extensive excavations in northern Italy were carried out at Velleia, a small town on the Apennine slopes near Piacenza. Originally established as an administrative and commercial center for a wide mountainous region, Velleia showed surprising wealth during the early empire. Inscriptions, statues, bronzes, and everyday items revealed this prosperity, which would be hard to guess from architecture alone. Like many small towns in Italy and the provinces, Velleia developed gradually across a hillside, shaped more by the terrain than by a uniform plan. In the time of Augustus, the town center was reorganized with a rectangular forum and civic buildings. The rectangular forum had a basilica at the upper end and a temple at the lower end. On either side of the temple, there were large rooms probably used as the Curia, Senate Hall, or other municipal offices. Shops lined the longer sides of the forum, surrounded by porticos supported by plastered brick columns. The basilica was a large rectangular hall measuring 34.85 by 11.70 meters, opening onto the forum along one long side. It was architecturally simple, Each short end had a two-column structure. The basilica, like the stone paving of the Forum, was built as a donation from a wealthy local citizen. Inside were 11 statues of the Julio-Claudian family and the famous bronze tablets describing Trajan's welfare programs. Buildings around the Forum were rebuilt to match the rectangular plan. But other structures, like the small amphitheater and baths, kept their older, irregular layouts. Many streets were lined with porticos, offering shelter in winter and shade in summer. These became models for the arcaded streets of medieval cities like Bologna and Padua. Velleia's Forum layout was repeated in various forms across Italy and the western provinces. A simpler version was found at Martigny, ancient Octodurus, in Switzerland, just past the Great St. Bernard Pass. Augustus re-established it as Forum Augusti Valentium. Later, under Claudius, a more monumental version was built, including a 45 by 55 meter rectangular square, side shops, and a basic basilica or market hall at the north end. A more developed example is Brixia, ancient Brixia, rebuilt under Vespasian. Its long and narrow forum measured 40 by 139 meters. It had colonnaded porticos on both sides. These featured projecting cornices, an innovation seen in buildings like the Forum Transitorium in Rome and the amphitheater at Nîmes. At the far end of the forum was a terraced Capitolium raised above the main cross street. This kind of arrangement was common in the western provinces, such as at Aosta and Saint-Bertrand de Comminges. The Capitolium had a design that resembled Renaissance architect Palladio's drawings. It featured a projecting porch with 6 columns and a triangular pediment at the center of a 3-room layout. At the opposite end of the forum stood a basilica, which covered the entire width of the square. It had 3 doors and an outer wall lined with fluted pilasters. The inner walls had flat pilasters too, hinting at an internal colonnade or gallery. Right next to the main forum was another monumental area, dominated by a theater. Although we lack detailed information, the overall plan is clear and shows that similar developments occurred in many Roman towns in northern Italy during the early empire. A more specific and better preserved case is the city of Assisi. Here, the sloping terrain prevented a long rectangular forum, so the forum was placed sideways along the slope. A temple was built at a higher level in the middle of the forum, and it still survives today. However, this kind of forum development was mainly a civic trend, even though it may show some influence from military planning. In rare cases like Aosta, military design had a direct effect. But in most cases, the influence went both ways. Military camps became more permanent and began to copy civilian architecture. This two-way exchange was especially common in border areas and later spread elsewhere. However, we should be careful not to assume that buildings like Trajan's Forum or Basilica, just because they look similar to army headquarters, were purely military in design. Both civic and military buildings evolved together as part of a shared development process, especially in new northern Italian cities and provincial settlements. Only a few isolated monuments in northern Italy deserve detailed comment. One is the Temple of Roma and Augustus in Pola, built between AD 2 and 14. It was one of 2 symmetrical temples beside a much larger Capitolium on the forum's north side. It had 4 Corinthian columns, and its frieze featured acanthus scrolls similar to those on the Arapacis in Rome. Another is the bridge in Rimini that carried the Via Aemilia across the river. Built in AD 22 during Tiberius's reign, it had 5 equal arches made of precisely cut stone. The piers had decorative niches, and the bridge, including its parapets, remains nearly intact today. A dramatic early bridge also survives at Narni. carrying the Via Flaminia 30 meters above the river. Its arches were nearly perfect semicircles, but varied in width, so they rested at different heights on the piers. Like the Pont du Gard, projecting stones were left on the piers to help with maintenance. The largest and most diverse group of surviving monuments in northern Italy are arches and city gates. Examples in Aosta, Susa, and Turin have already been discussed. These structures served many purposes: city gates, entrances to forums, platforms for statues, or even tomb monuments. The earliest datable example in the north is the Arch in Rimini, built in 27 BC to celebrate the completion of the Via Flaminia. A second similar arch stood outside Rome at Pons Mulvius. These early arches resembled low-relief images framed by pediments, but the Rimini arch shows a freer and more decorative combination of parts. Its proportions were wider, and the pediment no longer sat neatly between the columns. The Arch of the Sergii in Pola, built in the last decades of the 1st century BC, is a more elaborate version of the arch at Susa. It replaced single half columns with pairs, and the upper section repeated the design of the lower facade. Ravenna's Porta Aurea, from the time of Claudius, is known from Renaissance drawings and ruins. It was much more complex, with twin arches and twin pediments. It was framed by 3 pairs of half columns, with wider spacing on the sides to allow room for niches and medallions. It likely had a gallery above, like other gates, though this is not confirmed. Its rich decorations are typical of the Julio-Claudian period in Italy. Verona's 2 city gates are simpler in decoration, but more complex in layout. The Porta dei Leoni's visible facade likely covers an earlier building from Augustus's time, known from Renaissance drawings. It closely resembles Turin's Porta Palatina, with stone arches set in a brick wall and a mixed Doric Corinthian order on the lower level. After the civil wars of AD 69, it was rebuilt, showing architectural changes over the previous century. The lower part kept its basic plan, but the carriageways were now framed by half columns and triangular pediments. The upper arches housed niches, and the gallery above was completely redesigned. 4 twisted columns stood on projecting bases and framed a central statue niche. Simpler designs decorated the 2 wings. The nearby Porta dei Borsari, from around the same period, looks more like older models, but has highly Baroque details. Twisted columns, contrasting curved and triangular pediments, projecting pilasters, alternating niches and plain columns, and a dramatic contrast between the 2 galleries. The upper gallery's niches were placed directly above the openings below. While all these features existed earlier in Italy, the exact rhythm and design likely drew inspiration from the eastern provinces, where Baroque architecture had stronger roots. The latest example of early imperial arches in northern Italy is the Arch of Trajan at Ancona, built in AD 115. Around the same time, in AD 114, another arch was built in Benevento in central Italy. At first glance, the 2 look very different. The Ancona arch is elegant and simple, decorated only with framed panels and bronze wreaths. In contrast, the Benevento arch appears heavier and more elaborate, filled with symbolic and allegorical reliefs. However, both designs were clearly inspired by the Arch of Titus in Rome. The Gavi Arch in Verona shows that this return to classical forms wasn't limited to Rome. The periods of Trajan and Hadrian marked the end of an era for northern Italy, just as they did for Rome. Provincial regions, especially northern Italy, helped spread Roman architectural styles and techniques to the European provinces. It's useful to review the different building types found in these areas. Structures like theaters and amphitheaters were already explained, but the meaning of certain types could change depending on the context. and their architectural background helps us better understand their design. Every Roman town had a central forum. This space remained a key part of Mediterranean urban life, serving many roles: marketplace, political meeting spot, law court, entertainment venue, social hub, and religious center. In short, the forum was a public square, and this function never completely disappeared. As cities grew more complex, many of these activities moved elsewhere. Specialized buildings such as basilicas, markets, theaters, amphitheaters, and temples appeared. These structures could be located next to the forum or in other areas, depending on local needs. There were no strict rules. For example, Rome's cattle market moved early to the riverbank, while gladiator fights were held in the Forum Romanum until the end of the Republic. In the late Republic, the Forum began to take on a more standardized architectural form, especially in provincial towns and the Western Empire. Rome's Forum Romanum, with its historical importance, didn't allow for radical redesign, so the imperial forums were built instead. These new forums showed how a powerful and independent forum design developed. In Trajan's forum, two traditions merged into a model that late antiquity saw as the ideal Roman forum. One of the most common buildings near forums was the basilica. Originally, this word referred to a large columned hall with upper windows. Some early Republican basilicas in Rome matched this description. Later, many buildings with different designs were still called basilicas. For instance, a basilica in Velleia from Augustus's time looked different from the classic type, but was still called a basilica because it stood next to the forum. The term basilica was also used for many other buildings: rooms next to theater stages, bath chambers, reception halls in villas, cloth markets, silver workshops, indoor exercise halls for soldiers, or meeting halls for religious groups. Many of these didn't fit the true architectural definition of a basilica. Over time, basilica simply came to mean any large covered hall. This wide use has caused confusion, especially in discussions about the origins of Christian basilicas. Still, in antiquity, unless otherwise stated, a basilica was a large public hall tied to civic life, a meaning still useful today. Another key monument type was the Capitolium, which represented Roman authority in the provinces. It was based on the state temple of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva in Rome. The form of the Capitolium varied a lot. Some followed the triple cell plan, others looked like regular temples, and some adapted to local styles. For example, in Merida and Quicul, the cella was divided into aisles with columns. In Thuga and Timgad, there were 3 apses. In Bailo and Sufetula, 3 temples stood side by side. At Lambesis, there was a double cell design. Despite the variety, what defined a Capitolium was whom it was dedicated to. Usually, but not always, it was built in or near a town center and marked a step toward Roman citizenship. Capitolia also appeared in the eastern provinces, though less commonly. A famous example is in Jerusalem's replacement city, Aelia Capitolina, founded by Hadrian in AD 137. But Capitolia were far more common in the West, where Roman gods were more easily accepted. A related religious type was the cult temple of the emperor, and sometimes the goddess Roma. This practice, starting in the East during Augustus's reign, was rooted in Hellenistic tradition. In Rome, living emperors were not openly worshipped for a long time. However, their divine predecessors were honored, and this indirect form of worship spread widely, even to the West. For instance, Sabratha had a Capitolium, while nearby Lepsus had a temple to Roma and Augustus built during Tiberius's reign. Some of these temples were state-sponsored, like the Claudius Temple in Colchester. Others were built by private citizens. Architecturally, they came in many forms. They could be standalone temples like those in Rome, Pompeii, and Ostia, or added on to basilicas, such as at Fano, Lucus Feronii, or Sabratha. Temples called Caesarea, built for Caesar in Antioch and Alexandria, formed a distinctive model that also influenced structures like the Porticus Divorum in Rome. Another Roman building type was the Curia, or Senate House. Provincial curia, especially in Africa, were modeled directly or indirectly on Rome's Senate building. In eastern cities, many preferred the Greek-style bouleuterion, an assembly hall with tiered seating like a theater. One restored example can be seen in Nisa on the river Meander. There were many standard Roman building types, but we should not overgeneralize their meanings. While these patterns reflected Roman thinking, they were also adapted flexibly to local needs. Often, the desire to appear more Roman came from the local population itself, not imposed by the central government. Every example deserves individual study. For now, it's enough to say that early Imperial Italy provided architectural models that were freely copied across the Western Empire. In contrast, they were rarer in the East, where older local traditions already shaped architecture. With the foundation of the empire, changes in architecture and society became more deeply rooted. The population kept growing quickly, and the lack of space was now a problem not just in large cities, but also in wealthy towns like Pompeii. Wealth was no longer just in the hands of a small elite class. It was starting to spread among a growing middle class. This new social group wanted their higher standard of living to be reflected in their homes as well. People were exchanging ideas more rapidly, and new building materials and techniques made it possible to bring these ideas to life. Roman house design entered a much more complex phase. It is difficult to clearly analyze all these changes because many different factors were at play. As more options became available, personal taste and other less rational factors began to influence design. Still, even before the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum in AD 79, we can notice some general trends taking shape. One of the most important trends was the wealthy class moving away from traditional houses in the city center to villas in the suburbs or the countryside. As land became more expensive in Pompeii, many older homes were turned into apartments or used for shops. Rich houses like the House of the Veti became exceptions. However, Pompeii was not a perfect example because it had been hit by a major earthquake in AD 62 and, like the rest of Italy, had begun to lose its commercial importance compared to the provinces. In Rome, it was still possible to keep a family home in the city center, like the house built by Nero's father near the Via Sacra, or the Flavian family's home on the Esquiline Hill. But for a rich landowner to truly show off their architectural ambitions, the countryside became the preferred setting. In cities, rising population pressures pushed people to build more space-saving structures that could grow upward. Older houses didn't disappear all at once. Some could still be seen on Rome's marble city plan in the early 3rd century. But new buildings no longer followed the traditional atrium peristyle house layout, which had become too costly. One major change was the decline of the atrium. Once the physical and social center of the Italic house, the atrium began to lose its importance during the late Republic, as people spent more time in the brighter and more private peristyle section. Some homeowners and architects tried to preserve the idea by surrounding the atrium with columns to create a small peristyle. This design, called the Atrium Corinthium by Vitruvius, can be seen in the house of the same name in Herculaneum. But by AD 79, more radical changes had taken place. As upper floors and galleries were added, the atrium became just a passageway or skylight in many homes, and in some cases, it disappeared completely. The peristyle took over as both the social and architectural center of the house. This transition can be clearly seen in two houses on the southern edge of Herculaneum. In the late Julio-Claudian period, this area was built up with luxurious homes that took advantage of the sea view and the old city walls. In the house of the mosaic atrium, traditional forms were still partly preserved in the north wing. Along the main axis of the house were a central atrium with no side rooms, a servant's room, an entrance hallway, and a kitchen. The usual tablinum was replaced by an unusual basilica-style winter dining room, described by Vitruvius as an ucus Egyptius. The central garden was built in the new style, with brick half-columns and supports framing large square windows along a corridor on 3 sides, instead of the open colonnades of a typical Paris style. On the 4th side, narrow corridors and a row of living spaces with wooden and glass frames completed the area. To the south, another row of rooms opened onto a sea-facing outer portico. At both ends of the portico were 2 small projecting rooms, dietae, framing the terrace. In the center was the main summer dining and reception room of the private part of the house, facing both the garden and the sea. In this new house layout, the term triclinium is fitting for this room. The entire house had upper floors built over smaller rooms. In the nearby House of the Stags, built around the same time, these changes had gone even further. The main atrium here was completely roofed over and served only as an entrance and passageway. The effort to keep the traditional layout seen in the north wing of the mosaic atrium house was abandoned in favor of a symmetrical design around the garden courtyard. The inner triclinium faced the garden directly, and the side corridors no longer copied the old peristyle style. The southern terrace wing was symmetrically arranged around a large outdoor triclinium. The garden terrace was surrounded by 2 small dietae with scenic views, used for daytime rest. This terrace wing reflected a special kind of luxury, allowing the owner to enjoy a fashionable view, even in a city house. The symmetrical courtyard plan and the importance of the triclinium show not only changes in Italian house layouts, but also alignment with advanced peristyle houses in other Mediterranean provinces. Another example from Pompeii is the House of Laurius Tiburtinus, which was still being renovated and redecorated when Mount Vesuvius erupted. The front part of the house followed the old layout, built around a large 2-story atrium. But the small peristyle was now just a small extension of the larger garden terrace on the north side. The main living areas were arranged similarly to the House of the Stags. The terrace and garden were laid out in a T-shape with pergolas, small temple-shaped decorations, statues, and pools. From the central triclinium, the open-air dining room on the east side, or the diety rooms on the west side, the viewer's gaze was directed toward the distant mountains beyond the garden. The destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum in AD 79 caused the loss of our most detailed examples of single-family city houses in central Italy. The individuality of the last houses in Pompeii shows us that we should not try to force later examples into a rigid development model. Houses like the one excavated in the 18th century on the Esquiline Hill or the 2nd century House of Fortuna Annonaria in Ostia represent natural results of the process described above. In Ostia, a typical 2nd or 3rd century private house had a portico opening directly onto the street and rooms arranged around a garden or courtyard on 3 or 4 sides. But this type no longer defined the main direction of city housing. By the 2nd century, and even from the mid-1st century in Rome, the focus shifted away from the domus, or traditional city house, toward the insula, or multi-story apartment block. Just like today, the term insula was often misunderstood in ancient times. Back then, it referred specifically to apartment buildings where several families lived together. This was different from the domus, which was a private, single-family house. an insula could occupy an entire city block. But more often, it was just one of several buildings within that block. This housing type emerged in response to population pressure and the rise of a growing middle class. Its importance becomes clear when we look at regional records from the 4th century. While there were only about 1,700 domus in Rome, there were around 46,000 insulae. The key feature of the insula was its height in comparison to its footprint. This wasn't entirely new. Older Roman rental housing had already started to grow upward, but those early buildings were highly unsafe and often collapsed in fires, killing those inside. With the invention of better building materials and techniques, these structures became safer, more stable, and, by ancient standards, more fire-resistant during the early empire. These changes had already started to reach Pompeii and Herculaneum before AD 79. But it was after the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64 that insulae built from brick and concrete became the standard in urban housing. The clearest expression of this new trend can be seen a generation later in the apartment buildings of Ostia. To modern visitors, the insulae of Ostia may appear similar, but the real strength of the design was its flexibility. The simplest layouts were likely the oldest. In late Republican Pompeii, we already find rows of shops with added upper floors. This kind of design might have started in Rome and been brought to Pompeii by settlers during Sulla's time. In Ostia, basic insulae can still be found along the main Cardo between the Forum and the river, or along the Decumanus in front of the Baths of Neptune. A similar design without shops was applied in planned blocks, like houses 12 and 13 in Region 1. A more advanced example appears in Region 3, House 9, where 2 large apartment blocks were built on either side of a central garden. Unlike the inward-facing houses of Pompeii, the use of glass windows in Ostia allowed many rooms to get natural light from the outside. This may have helped develop the most impressive version of the insula, blocks arranged like Renaissance palaces around central courtyards. These courtyards varied in size and often had arches. In the House of Diana, the courtyard was just a large skylight, while in the House of the Muses it was a spacious central space. Upper floors were accessed through separate staircases. In better buildings, glass windows were common. While water came from shared fountains, some apartments had their own toilets and garbage chutes. Heating was provided by portable braziers. Even though fragile interior decorations have not survived, these apartments offered a standard of living for the middle class that was unmatched in the ancient world. From the outside, these buildings had a plain and serious look. This simplicity was sometimes softened by horizontal moldings or projecting balconies. Still, the real charm came from the high-quality brickwork and the balanced pattern of doors, arches, and windows. Bricks were often left uncovered, sometimes painted with a reddish glaze, and the white mortar lines were highlighted. This was a practical, functional type of architecture. The integration of ground-floor shops gave these buildings a surprisingly modern look. Whether there was a true architectural continuity between classical Rome and the medieval or Renaissance city is debatable, but many of the solutions seem remarkably similar. That's why the best way to follow a visit to Ostia's ruins is a walk through the old streets of Trastevere in Rome. Outside the cities, things were quite different. The divide between townhouses and country homes had started long before. Although Rome began as a community of small farmers, by the late Republic and the time of Augustus, it had developed into a very class-based society. We still don't fully understand the effects of this social shift on Italy's countryside, but one clear result of a wider social spectrum was a more diverse way of life. On one end were large landowners with estates spread across central Italy and beyond. While they weren't incredibly rich by modern standards, people like Cicero had more than 10 properties across Latium and Campania. Some landowners still liked to live close to their estates. Writers like Cato, Varro, and Columella, who focused on agriculture, show how much they could contribute to the prosperity of their land. However, by the late Republic and early Empire, many began using their estates as part-time retreats and filled them with comforts equal to those in the city. On the other end of the scale were the small farmers and tenants who lived on the land and worked it, often alongside freedmen and slaves. The architecture of rural Italy in the early Empire reflects this background. At first, the variety of buildings may seem confusing, but they can generally be grouped into three broad categories: luxurious rural homes owned by the wealthy, similar to the villae rusticae of Renaissance Italy; working farmhouses that also included living space for visiting owners; and the simple homes of small farmers or tenants. There were, of course, many examples that didn't fit neatly into any one category, but these three types give us a basic framework. During the time of Augustus, two major styles of wealthy country villas were common. The first, seen around the Roman Campania and southern Latium, was compact and built on a platform. The second, especially common along the Campanian coast, was more open, with large porticos and a relaxed layout. These two types had already begun to blend, which isn't surprising since both came from the same roots: the Italic atrium house and the Greek-style courtyard house. In cities, this blend had created the inward-facing atrium peristyle house. In the countryside, however, homes started opening up to the outdoors much earlier. One of the best examples is the Villa of the Mysteries near Pompeii. The upper northeast side featured a peristyle courtyard added in the late 2nd century BC. Later, in the mid-1st century AD, the southwest wing was rebuilt to include a large half-circle veranda and two cozy corner rooms, dietae. The step-by-step changes in this villa show the two opposing trends in rural home design during the late Republic and early Empire, one toward the compact courtyard-centered platform villa, and the other toward more outward-facing buildings that blended with the landscape and had a semi-monumental appearance. Platform villas from the Republican period were common throughout the countryside, from Sabina down through Latium and Campania. Many were still simple single-story buildings with rectangular layouts built around a central courtyard. Examples include the well-known villas near Pompeii and the recently excavated San Rocco Villa in northern Campania. But even before the end of the Republic, there was a growing trend to extend terraces outward to catch summer breezes and take advantage of scenic views. It was only a small step from this to building multi-level villas stretched along the slope of a hill. Around Terracina and Gaeta, such terraced villas continued to be built into the 2nd century AD. A well-documented example is the late Republican villa that Hadrian later included in his grand estate near Tivoli. It had two levels. The lower platform had a garden with a typical Republican nymphaeum, monumental fountain, and the upper one held the main house. Along the central axis of the villa were an atrium, followed by a tablinum, a formal reception room, another tablinum opening onto a large peristyle, and finally a stepped, semicircular exedra cut into the hillside. The second type of villa from the early Empire had a more scattered and relaxed layout, making it harder to recognize on the ground. However, since these villas appear often in wall paintings from Pompeii and Herculaneum, usually shown with views of the sea, it suggests that this type developed locally. It probably became popular in the last decades of the 1st century BC, when the coast of Campania started replacing Formia and Gaeta as the new vacation spot for wealthy Romans. In such beautiful settings with strong Greek influences, it's understandable that these villas focused more on blending with nature than on strict architectural rules. One example, though located far from Campania, is the villa at Val Catena, on the island of Brioni Grande in the northern Adriatic. Even though it was built in stages and dates from a slightly later period, its loose layout around a small bay is very similar to the villas painted in Campania. The main living block ran along the southern coast of the bay, facing north. It was a large, single-story rectangular building, about 70 by 80 meters, grouped around two peristyle courtyards with a terrace and a portico facing the harbor. To the east of the main building was a carefully designed garden stretching towards the sea, protected by a breakwater and including a private docking area. The northern shore of the bay was more irregular, and this uneven shape was deliberately used in the placement of buildings and piers. Among the main features here were a small harbor, a series of sunlit rooms facing south in the middle of the bay, and a large bath complex with a U-shaped portico also facing south. Opposite the main house, on the other side of the bay, was a 145-meter-long portico, aligned slightly southeast along the shoreline. At the far end of the bay was a grand architectural arrangement that connected the house and the long portico while overlooking the entire area. This included a curved Doric-style portico with three small shrines placed symmetrically in the center and ends, and behind them, a second story supported by a covered walkway called a cryptoporticus. The whole layout was diverse and fascinating. Especially on the northern shore, the living quarters and bath complex showed a variety of design elements. These buildings were organized around a large curved courtyard that echoed the slope of the terrace in front of it. Along this curve ran a continuous portico, only broken at the top of the arc by four large columns that supported a projecting pediment. This marked the position of a large open or semi-open triclinium dining room, which looked out over the sea and back into a peristyle garden through arched openings. On both sides of this main room were smaller side rooms called dietae. The long portico had a simpler layout. It provided a shaded walking path for the owner and guests, with benches or niches set into the back wall for resting and enjoying the view. At the center was a square room that may have been used for private dining, and at the far southwestern end, this example shows that the painted villa seen in the house of Lucretius Fronto in Pompeii was probably not imaginary. The artist may have drawn it from real villas seen on nearby coasts. In that painting, like the villa at Val Catena, we see a porticoed front, a curved recess in the middle, and a round pavilion that might have held a fountain. The extended porticos at the corners resemble those in the Damacuta villa on Capri. Similar projecting wings appear in another Campanian wall, painting from Stabiae, and also resemble the U-shaped layouts of villas near Punta Barbariga in Dalmatia. Other paintings from Campania, such as those in Naples, show the spacious structure of these coastal or lakeside villas. They often had long, low porticos and intentionally irregular arrangements. Trees, rocks, and water gave unity and meaning to these designs. This was architecture created within and for a landscape. Refined, yes, but also deeply expressive and carefully crafted. A real example of such a villa from the time of Augustus can be found on Capri. While the island is better known as the place where Tiberius retired in his later years, it was first purchased by Augustus about 50 years earlier, and he used it as a summer retreat. The villa he built there, known as Palazzo a Mare, stretched across a low ridge on the island's north coast, about half a mile west of Marina Grande, 30 to 45 meters above sea level. Although many of the buildings still stood into the 19th century, they were heavily damaged later. And today, their details are hard to reconstruct. But the overall layout, with a series of terraces running for over 600 meters, can still be traced. The main residential block was on the east end, with a bathhouse directly behind it. Farther west, at a slightly lower level, was a U-shaped portico opening onto a garden facing the sea. From there, the terraces gently sloped downward, shifting slightly in alignment, and finally ended in the so-called Baths of Tiberius, built into the rock. This section had its own pool or small harbor. A larger harbor was located to the east, and numerous cisterns spread across the area showed how important water was for villa life. Judging by the remains, this villa was not especially grand or luxurious, but its long stretch along the cliffs and the harmony it created with the forested hills behind made it a clear example of this type of villa, where nature and architecture were inseparably joined. Later and better preserved villas on Capri include Villa Jovis and the Damacuta Villa, both connected with Emperor Tiberius and reflecting his secretive personality. Villa Jovis sits on a high cliff at the island's eastern tip, above a drop of 1,000 feet to the sea. The location left little space for a broad layout, and Tiberius's suspicious nature didn't allow for easy access. Yet, despite these limits, the architect still designed a home that shared the same principles as other coastal villas, blending architecture with its surroundings. Because water was scarce at that height, the heart of the villa was a large square courtyard built on top of a network of big vaulted cisterns. Around this central core, 4 main wings were added at different levels, linked by stairs and ramps. The entrance was at the southwest corner and included a columned hall and a guard room. On the south side was a bath complex, connected to the main building by a corridor. The west wing, built against the outer wall of the cisterns, held rooms for Tiberius's staff. These included 3 levels of small, cell-like rooms opening onto narrow hallways. The northern and eastern sides held the emperor's private quarters, carefully guarded from outside access. The eastern rooms were larger and backed by a semicircular projection that may have served as audience and reception halls. The northern section contained 4 rooms, behind which, almost entirely separated from the rest of the villa, were the emperor's private apartments. These were small but richly decorated, opening onto a secure terrace. Steps from the terrace led to a lookout point with a wide view of the island and the Bay of Naples. From the private apartments, a corridor with ramps and stairs descended to a long, narrow terrace walk, placed about 20 meters below the main level, along the steep northern slope. Like the walking area in Val Catena, this path had seating niches and a vaulted dining room in the center with side rooms attached. Besides the main structures, the villa had several additional buildings: a watchtower and lighthouse on a hill about 100 meters south, a large kitchen block extending from the western wing, and a separate building believed to be the observatory of Tiberius's astrologer, Thrasyllus. On the western slopes were traces of gardens, completing this impressive but secluded residence. Among all the Roman buildings that still survive today, very few can reflect the personality of an unknown architect and their skill in designing within such a difficult yet stunning landscape as clearly as this one. On a dry mountain peak, the emperor could both handle state affairs and enjoy complete solitude during the summer. He lived surrounded by natural beauty, absolute security, a large service staff, and every comfort imaginable. While a modern person might criticize the kitchen's location, by the standards of the time, it was large and well-equipped. The design of the villa was both thoughtful and skillful. Unlike other luxury villas that often had scattered layouts, this one used a compact plan with clever changes in levels to create variety. If a more open layout had been used, it might have led to confusion in such a limited space. The Damacuta Villa, another villa on Capri, was located on a broad headland 150 meters above sea level, gently sloping from Anacapri toward the island's northwest corner. Unlike the dramatic Villa Jovis, Damacuta had more space for spreading out. Because it was more accessible, it has been more severely damaged over time. The main remains today are on steep cliffs to the northwest. A familiar walkway runs along the cliff edge, with benches facing inland. At the southwest end, remains of a residence with a slanted projecting front facing the sea can be seen. Columns once supported a gallery along this facade. At the other end of the path, under a medieval tower likely built on a scenic terrace, a narrow ramp leads to a set of small but luxurious rooms, probably the emperor's private quarters, like at Villa Jovis. It's likely that both villas were designed by the same architect. The key difference is that at Damacuta, the architect had more freedom to follow traditional layouts, making it similar to Augustus's summer villa, the Palazzo a Mare. The bathhouses, service buildings, and guest rooms were spread over a large area, probably including carefully planned gardens and landscapes. Continuing this story in such detail goes beyond the limits of a general study on Roman architecture. And it's not really necessary. When we consider the growing luxury of the early 1st century, the impact of new materials, and the many social changes happening at the time, the main story is really about how the architectural themes developed under Augustus and the emperors who followed. Interestingly, one of these developments returned to Rome itself. Roman tastes in gardening and landscape, which had originally come from the Hellenistic world, took root in Italy. By the end of the Republic, these tastes were showing in various ways, adding peristyles to atrium-style city houses, building grand garden porticos like those of Pompey and Livia, and in country villas with landscaped views, especially in southern Latium and Campania. A few generations later, this trend extended to the Adriatic coast and northern Italy. As cities became more crowded, suburban villas and gardens, horti, for the wealthy, also grew. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, Rome was surrounded by private estates like a belt, just as it would be by Renaissance villas up to 1870. Some of these estates were later developed into buildings, like the Baths of Agrippa and Augustus's Mausoleum, which were built in areas that had once been Republican-era gardens. Others, like the gardens of Lucullus, Sallust, and Maecenas, remained as parks with attached residences. These places, neither fully urban nor fully rural, became natural meeting points for two architectural traditions. For example, the semicircular layout of the early Augustan suburban villa at Farnesina closely resembled villas in Campania. These gardens also became places for architectural experimentation. As noted earlier, the small garden pavilions, fountains, and artificial caves in these areas may have influenced new ideas about space seen in palaces from the end of the 1st century. In many ways, these places resembled English 18th century landscape parks. To understand the intellectual ideas behind their features, like porticos, garden terraces, azistoi, and areas named Academy at Hadrian's Villa or Stadium at the Domus Augustana, we must turn to the writings of Cicero or Pliny. Over time, many of these estates were taken over by the emperors. This gave them space to explore bold and grand architecture. Caligula and Nero were among the first to do this. During Nero's time, several factors came together to push architecture in a dramatic new direction. Nero was born in Antium, modern Anzio, and one of his earliest projects was to redesign his birth villa. Although little of this villa remains, and it hasn't been studied much, it likely resembled other luxury coastal homes. Around AD 60, Nero also built a villa at Subiaco. This project centered on an earlier building, but its innovation was to flood the valley below, creating an artificial lake that made the mountain valley feel like a coastal retreat. Nero also began combining several imperial estates into a single large residence, the Domus Transitoria, which later evolved into the famous Golden House, Domus Aurea. This vast complex included a central artificial lake and was surrounded by parkland, making it feel like a suburban villa, right in the middle of Rome. Never again would such a rural fantasy be built at this scale inside the city. The desire to combine the comforts of urban life with the pleasures of the countryside defined early imperial rural architecture. This blending of peristyles and porticos began to erase the boundary between city and country, between nature and art. When Tiberius or Caligula redesigned the upper terrace of Pompey's villa at Albano, they used the stunning sea view toward Lanuvium and created a layout similar to the Stag House at Herculaneum, a central pergola and garden, flanked by 2 rooms, dieta. But here, the standard rectangular design was abandoned. These rooms were angled to make the most of summer and winter sunlight. Behind them, more rooms were arranged around a curved northeast-facing structure. This plan reflected the latest fashion in suburban villas. From here, it was a short step to the idea of the octagonal room in Nero's Golden House. 50 years later, Pompey's villa became part of Domitian's vast estate at Albano. His rural retreat near Lake Paola was a typical coastal portico villa. But the Albano estate was something else, comparable in size and grandeur to the Golden House, or Hadrian's villa. Though it wasn't called a palace, it functioned as one. The park stretched from Castel Gandolfo to Albano and beyond, even including older landscaped villas. Some structures can still be identified: a theater, stadium, gymnasium terraces, walkways, piers, and numerous pavilions and fountains. The main residence was on the lowest of 3 descending terraces facing the lake. Although not well studied, it likely had at least 3 stories and used the most advanced building techniques and materials, just like Rabirius's work on the Palatine Hill. All these traditions reached their peak in Hadrian's grand villa at Tivoli. While the architecture of individual buildings belongs to his own time, the overall plan, with its use of natural terrain and contrasting axes, was directly inspired by earlier landscaped villas. The themes of the buildings go even further back, to the villas of the late Republic. Gymnasiums, libraries, sculpture galleries, theaters, towers like the Roccabruna, covered walkways for exercise, like the Pasile, bathhouses, pavilions, and open-air dining halls. Their names were not just personal whims of a widely traveled emperor. They reflected classical traditions and symbols. Hadrian's love for Greek culture only strengthened these tendencies. The imperial and elite rural homes were just one part of the Roman countryside. But these homes increasingly reflected the most modern trends in architecture. Alongside these large estates, there were still many smaller homes, where the peristyle layout remained the standard. Some early villas were modernized, but still kept the original courtyard-based design. For example, Pliny the Younger's Tuscan villa still had a traditional atrium. Across the Mediterranean, from Spain to Syria, the peristyle house was the normal upper-class residence in both city and country. As regional differences faded, Italy itself began to adopt styles from the provinces. Unfortunately, we don't know much about small rural houses in Roman Italy, since few have been systematically excavated. In fact, we know more about similar homes in Roman Britain. But among the more ambitious rural homes, the peristyle villa remained the most common type into late antiquity. There were also simpler, more practical homes, but we know even less about them. For now, they remain mostly in the realm of archaeologists and social historians, rather than classical architectural studies. In the later stages of the Roman Empire, suburban and rural villas in Italy began to shift focus away from landscape design and grand layouts emphasizing instead the detailed architecture of individual buildings. Most villa owners made only modest changes to traditional layouts, but under emperors like Domitian and Hadrian, some attempted to modernize villas using new concrete techniques. One such effort was the large platform villa known as the Grotta di Catullo, built likely in the early 2nd century at the northern tip of the Sirmione Peninsula by Lake Garda. Its layout followed a symmetrical plan along a north-south axis. The central rectangular block measured 180 by 105 meters and had smaller rectangular structures on each end. The northern section, which likely held a triclinium facing the view with adjacent dieta rooms and perhaps a pergola, was set on massive substructures to create a terrace. Other living spaces faced a large garden courtyard in the center, resembling a monumental version of a peristyle villa and showing similarities to the ceremonial wing of the Domus Augustana. However, the Grotta di Catullo remained an isolated experiment. A better reflection of 2nd century villa development is found at the Sette Bassi villa, located near Rome along the Via Latina. Built in 3 rapid phases between around AD 140 and 160, it began with a compact residential block to the south of a large garden peristyle. This first structure was mostly single-story, with a few small rooms on the upper level. Soon after, a new wing was added to the west, built on a terrace supported by substructures. This smaller addition had a more ambitious design, including a fountain courtyard surrounded by a portico and a curved veranda at the center of the southern half. Its outer terrace wall featured shallow segmental arches resting on travertine brackets, similar to those seen on Ostian balconies or Trajan's market. The third phase was the most elaborate. A new north wing was built, along with a long cryptoporticus over 300 meters in length, surrounding the west and south sides. This wing had an imposing scale and was raised on terraces. On the east end, it included rooms around an arched courtyard, one a bath suite, while the west end contained 2 very large reception halls with high ceilings. These halls stood independently from the other buildings, occupying the entire width between 2 corridors and rising above their roofs. Though not symmetrical, their triple windows and pedimented roofs made them visual focal points. This villa borrowed much from earlier designs. Its garden layout, for instance, echoed the stadium theme. But it was also thoroughly modern. Features like arched courtyards, tall windows, brick and tough paneling using the opus mixtum method, and projecting balconies were taken from contemporary urban architecture. The high windows and the corridors running along the facade point toward later trends found in places like Split. Its peristyle and carefully designed fountain courtyard foreshadowed layouts found in 4th century Ostian houses. Perhaps most strikingly, sloping buttresses and corner towers supporting the cryptoporticus were early signs of late antique and medieval architectural features. The Sette Bassi villa is notable for applying advanced techniques and decorative masonry to give rural villas a new sense of monumentality. Domitian appears to have started this trend at his villa in Albano. 2- or 3-story tower-like buildings were also common in other rich villas around Rome, such as the Villa of the Quintili on the Via Appia or the Mura di San Stefano near Anguillara. Elsewhere in central Italy, wealthy villas largely stuck to established patterns. Elagabalus Horti Variani, still resembling a landscaped suburban villa, included a circus, amphitheater, Amphitheatrum Castrense, baths, Thermae Helenae, and a grand audience hall later turned into Santa Croce in Jerusalem by Constantine. Maxentius's villa, with its combined residence, circus, and mausoleum, reflected new architectural thinking, though many of its ideas were never widely adopted. The key examples from this period, which will be discussed later, are the large villa at Piazza Armerina and Diocletian's palace at Split. In late antiquity, the single-family domus surprisingly re-emerged. Ostia provides the best evidence for this trend. For nearly 2 centuries, single-family houses in Ostia were usually built around a colonnaded or arched courtyard, following the peristyle model. Good examples include the House of Fortuna Annonaria from the 2nd century and the later columned house, with a more traditional layout. These often featured a main dining room, triclinium, and in the Fortuna Annonaria house, the earliest known domestic central heating room. However, such houses were rare. Up until the mid-3rd century, wealthy urban dwellers typically lived in apartment buildings, insulae. As land values dropped in the late Empire, there was a shift from insulae back to domus-style homes. The late antique private houses in Ostia didn't follow a strict plan, but adapted to existing structures. Still, they shared common features: a courtyard with a decorated fountain, a few steps leading to a main living room, central heating in 1 or more rooms, private toilets in some cases, colorful marble on walls and floors, an interest in apses, and the use of triple-arched column arrangements instead of classical lintels. In the House of Fortuna Annonaria, innovations included an enlarged triclinium, a fountain on the south wall paired with a toilet, and a triple-arched colonnade facing the courtyard. In the House of Cupid and Psyche, a 2nd floor was unusually added over the west wing of small rooms. Yet over half of the ground floor was taken up by a richly decorated, centrally heated triclinium and a large main corridor. This corridor opened onto an arched colonnade facing the courtyard, which featured a fountain along the full length of the east wall. These homes mark a new chapter in Italian domestic architecture. While similar houses might be found in North Africa, the closest parallels come from contemporary Syrian houses, especially from excavations in Antioch. For example, the early 3rd century house at Seleucia, or the late 3rd century Menander house at Antioch, share the combination of triclinium and courtyard fountain, and an intentional lack of symmetry seen in Ostia. As old regional boundaries faded, it is natural that Ostia, connected in many ways to the east, would take inspiration from the wealthy and influential cities of the Roman East. In Italy, we can still talk about Roman architecture because the buildings closely reflect the style of the capital itself, needing little further explanation. Although local tastes and building techniques varied, these differences were mostly due to historical traditions, climate, materials, and construction practices that still defined much of Italy during the early empire. However, as Roman political control expanded, the empire had to deal with a very diverse mix of cultures at different levels of development. One of Rome's greatest achievements was that, after the period of exploitation and poor governance during the late Republic, it was able to bring these diverse groups together into a political system where people could feel truly Roman. But this was not immediate. In the early imperial period, the political unity of the empire did not yet match its extreme cultural, social, and linguistic diversity. That's why any study of classical art under the empire must consider both the shared features of a civilization built through peaceful and daily contact and the unique traits that came from different people's traditions and preferences. One of the most important cultural divisions within the empire was between the Greek-speaking eastern provinces and the Latin-speaking western ones. This was not just a language difference. Greek continued to be widely used in some Western areas among educated people, but also a difference in recent history. The eastern half of the empire had once been ruled by Hellenistic kingdoms after Alexander's death. These regions had their own long artistic traditions, or at least shared in the legacy of Hellenistic culture. So Rome encountered people who were equal to or even more advanced in the arts. In contrast, in much of Western Europe, Rome met societies that were less developed despite their potential. Over time, this Romanization process became more of a two-way exchange. Still, at first, Rome led the way. Even within the Latin-speaking Western provinces, there were significant regional differences. Some looked toward the Mediterranean, others to the Atlantic or to rivers like the Rhine and Danube. Some provinces had a long history of urban life under the Greeks or Carthaginians. Others were still tribal. Some provinces quickly adopted Roman civic life, while others remained under military control for a long time. Natural conditions like climate and resources also shaped development. For example, wood was very abundant in northern and central Europe. So it's not surprising that the architecture of the provinces was extremely varied. Still, when compared to the provinces in the east, the European provinces showed more unity during the first 2.5 centuries of Roman rule. Much of this culture was directly modeled on Italy. That is why this section gives special focus to Gaul, which represents a good example of what happened along the empire's northern frontiers. Gaul is unique for how fully it embraced Roman culture and made it its own. In the west, Spain, or the Iberian Peninsula, was the only province besides Gaul to develop so early. Its people were among the first outside Italy to gain full Roman citizenship. Major Roman figures such as Seneca, Quintilian, and even emperors like Trajan and Hadrian were born in Roman Hispanic towns such as Cordoba, Caliguras, and Italica. Yet Spain has always been a land of strong contrasts. Although most of it came under Roman control as early as 206 BCE, it still took Augustus many years of hard fighting to conquer the entire peninsula. Despite its rich resources, especially minerals, Romanization in Spain was not as deep or widespread as in Gaul. Even considering that many Roman towns in Spain were later built over or abandoned, limiting our knowledge, it is clear that the Roman architectural legacy in Spain was relatively limited. Most of the grand monuments date from the early empire, between Augustus and Trajan. The 2 centuries of republican rule left almost no clear remains. Of course, some Roman-style buildings like fortresses and public structures must have been built during the Republic, especially in military colonies like Italica, founded in 206 BCE. But we don't know how much of their design followed Italian models, and how much came from local Hellenistic or Carthaginian traditions. Still, as in Provence or North Africa, the long-term effect of the Republic's presence was to prepare the way for the building boom that came under Augustus and his successors. A clear example is Augusta Emerita, modern Merida, founded as a military colony in 25 BCE. By 18 BCE, it already had a grand theater, and by 8 BCE, an amphitheater. It also had 3 aqueducts, a circus, and a 60-arch bridge over the Guadiana River. One of the notable features of these early buildings is their use of opus quadratum, large blocks of stone laid without mortar. The stonework quality depended heavily on the local materials. For instance, the famous aqueduct at Segovia is nearly 900 meters long, with 128 arches and a height of over 30 meters. Its rough stone blocks give it a strong and sturdy look. In contrast, the Los Milagros aqueduct in Merida was built with smaller stones and concrete, using alternating layers of brick and stone to create a surface similar to Gallic styles. The Tarragona aqueduct is more balanced in form, but also shows rougher stonework. Merida's bridge, on the other hand, uses very large blocks that resemble Renaissance-style decoration. The bridge at Alcantara, built by Trajan in 106 CE, is also highly praised. Though simple in appearance, it consists of 6 arches with 4 different spans and features a ceremonial gateway and a small temple on the central pier. One special feature is that the name of the architect, Gaius Julius Lycer, is carved into the structure, reminding us of Apollodorus of Damascus, another famous architect from Trajan's reign. One of the clearest examples of the Romanization process in the Iberian Peninsula can be seen at the archaeological site of Conimbriga, located in the Lusitania province near Coimbra in northern Portugal. This was originally a pre-Roman hilltop settlement. The older buildings were removed, and a new Roman-style town center was built. Even though this center was later demolished within a century, its foundations and some underground structures are still visible today, showing the town's original layout. At the heart of the site is a rectangular paved square measuring about 38 by 25 meters. The square was surrounded by colonnades on the south and west sides. Behind the western colonnade were shops, and on the eastern side stood a simple three-aisled basilica and probably a Curia, council building. The north end of the site had a slope, and a cryptoporticus, an underground passage, supported an elevated crosswise colonnade and the square-shaped inner chamber of a temple. This layout symbolized the three main aspects of Roman city life: state religion, structured administration, and commerce. Architecturally, it resembled the Forum at Velleia, and in the placement of the basilica, towards the end of the 1st century AD, the site was redesigned. The shops, basilica, and Curia were removed and replaced by a larger forum. This new forum had colonnades on 3 sides, and on the 4th side, an independent temple with 4 Corinthian columns. The plan was more elaborate, but followed a traditional Roman style. This layout could easily have belonged to any Western Roman province, much like the forum found at Sabratha in Tripolitania. In contrast, the south baths uncovered at the site showed more architectural development. The original baths, built in the time of Augustus, were modest, with hot and cold rooms, an open-air pool, and a small palaestra, resembling baths in Pompeii. But during Trajan's reign, a new, larger, and more decorative bath complex was built, arranged symmetrically along a north-south axis, similar to designs found in Roman Gaul. The findings at Conimbriga showed 2 major influences on provincial architecture in Hispania: early Italian models and later Gallic ones. The third major influence came from North Africa. Other buildings in Hispania worth mentioning include the Temple of Rome and Augustus in Barcelona, built in AD 16. It was a peripteral structure, similar to the Maison Carrée in Nîmes. In Bello, modern Bologna, near Cadiz, the Capitolium had 3 temples standing side by side, resembling the layout seen at Sufetula, Spitla, in North Africa. Luxurious private villas with floor plans and mosaic decorations also showed clear African influence. There was also a refined but traditional-style triumphal arch, commissioned by Licinius Sura, one of Trajan's generals. In Campera, a small 4-sided arched monument was built. The amphitheater at Italica, measuring 165 by 140 meters, was the 4th largest in the Roman world and hosted events like venations, animal hunts, which are seen as early forms of bullfighting. Even with all these examples, the number of major monuments in Hispania remains quite limited. In the late Roman period, Spanish architecture barely went beyond the kinds of buildings found in ordinary North African towns. In many ways, not only in architecture, Spain during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD seemed like a peripheral region. Among the western provinces of the Roman Empire, Gaul held a special position. This status came partly from its rich natural resources and its strategic location at the crossroads of northwestern Europe, and partly from historical circumstances that allowed a sensitive and adaptable people to absorb and use the best parts of classical civilization. The Mediterranean coast and the lower Rhone Valley also benefited from long-standing contact with the Greek colony of Massilia, modern Marseille. Because of this, it's no surprise that many of the most impressive early imperial monuments are found in Provence and the central and southern parts of Gaul. As in Spain, the influence of classical Roman culture didn't immediately result in a clearly Roman architectural style. Gallia Narbonensis, which roughly corresponds to modern Provence and Languedoc, was annexed in 121 BC. But major Roman-style public architecture only appeared after the Augustan building programs that started around 19 BC. To understand what life looked like in the previous century, we can look at Glanum, a small town near Saint-Rémy de Provence. Glanum was originally founded as a trading center by settlers from Massilia. Excavations from the pre-imperial period show that most of the buildings were private homes. These houses were rectangular and solidly built, with rooms arranged around a central courtyard with columns. Although they were different from the houses in Pompeii in layout, their comfort and construction quality were just as good. These homes offer a rare glimpse into the Greek cultural background and craftsmanship that helped make Roman Gaul a success. Between 58 and 51 BCE, Caesar conquered and annexed the three Gauls. These provinces, along with Gallia Narbonensis and the military frontier provinces of Upper and Lower Germany, included most of modern France and Belgium, parts of the Rhineland, the Netherlands, and parts of Switzerland. After the conquest, Caesar and later Augustus encouraged rapid and deliberate development. Retired Roman soldiers were settled in colonies like Arelate, Baeterai, Forum Julii, Narbo, and Arosio. New towns were built on newly conquered land: Lugdunum, Noviodunum, and Augusta Raurica. Older native towns like Nemausus and Vienna were given official municipal status. Across Gaul, new cities appeared along major roads or in place of tribal capitals. There were also two large public baths. One was built in the mid-1st century CE in the style of Pompeii and later updated. The second was more ambitious and built in the 2nd century. On the city's west side, a major sanctuary was shaped under Roman influence, with 3 temples and a large portico. A bath building stood near the entrance. This sanctuary was dedicated to the local god Sucellus, as well as to Asclepius and Apollo, and likely began as a local healing shrine near a sacred spring. Another small temple in the east was dedicated to the Anatolian goddess Cybele. It had a classical-style front courtyard, but the main temple behind was square and built in a local tradition, showing the mix of Roman and local religions. This picture of Aosta reflects what happened in many other early Gallic towns. In the first years of Roman rule, few public buildings were made beyond walls, aqueducts, and a few symbolic monuments. These were built with local materials and skills. However, these early plans allowed the cities to expand naturally once urban life took hold. It's clear that this architecture had strong roots in Italy, especially northern Italy, which had once been part of Gaul. The Roman civilization spread into Europe, based in part on the urban traditions from republican settlements in northern Italy. This is seen in the planning of cities like Augst and Aosta. City gates in Nimes and Autun are similar to those in Aosta, Turin, and Verona. Basilicas, temples, theaters, markets, all followed Italian examples. Even the masonry techniques confirm this link. Over time, the Italian influence grew. The Augst Forum Basilica arrangement was inspired by 1st century Velleia, but the double apses in the basilica suggest a later model from the Basilica Ulpia in Rome. The market resembles the one in Trajan's Forum. As Gaul connected more with other provinces, especially Provence, it received more distant influences. Still, Italy remained the main source of architectural ideas. The common building material in Gallic monuments was small stone blocks and a concrete core called petit appareil. Stone was a legacy of pre-Roman Provence, but gained prestige during Augustus's time. Petit appareil walls used neatly cut stones and mortar. Unlike Roman opus incertum or opus reticulatum, these walls used regular blocks. Though mortar quality varied, well-made walls were very durable. Later, thin layers of bricks were added for strength. Though similar to Hadrian's villa, in Gaul, these brick bands ran through the wall for stability. Roman-style brick concrete didn't spread widely beyond military areas until late antiquity. Wood was also common, even in public buildings at first, and houses used mud brick or wattle and daub. These methods continued into modern times in parts of France and Britain. Although the best early examples are in Provence, grand buildings were also built in Gaul's 3 provinces, and later in Britain and Germany. One key structure in these towns was the city gate, often like those in northern Italy, with multiple arches, round towers, and an upper gallery. Examples are in Nimes and Autumn. In Frejus and Aries, a different layout had a concave courtyard between 2 round towers. It's important to remember Nimes wasn't a military colony, but a Romanized tribal center, and Autumn was founded in 16 CE to replace Bibracte. By this time, city walls were more about prestige than defense. Another early priority was water supply. In Nimes, local springs were not enough, so Agrippa built an aqueduct from a spring 31 miles away, around 20 to 16 BCE. The aqueduct followed the land slope with gentle gradients and was mostly underground or on small walls. The steepest part was crossed by the famous Pont du Gard, 269 meters long and 49 meters high, built entirely from cut stone. Its arches follow a simple, elegant design with proportional ratios. The upper arches have built-in ledges to help with future repairs. Inside Nimes, a large circular basin and distribution system for water still remain. While aqueducts are the most famous Roman engineering works, Romans knew other ways to cross obstacles. In some places, they used pipes or pumps. For example, lead pipes crossed valleys in one of Lyon's 4 aqueducts, bringing 2.7 million liters of water daily. This method was used even under the Rhone River. A great example outside Gaul is the Aspendos aqueduct in Anatolia. But these systems were expensive to build and maintain. In early times, when labor was cheap, traditional aqueducts were preferred. Not many Roman bridges survive in Gaul, but major rivers like the Rhone and the Rhine surely had permanent crossings. Their piers were reinforced with iron-bound wooden piles and probably had wooden decks. Smaller bridges used stone arches. A good example is the decorated bridge at Saint-Chamond. The Rhone at Aries was crossed using floating bridges. In many towns, early imperial city centers were later built over. But like in Aosta, the later buildings often replaced simpler ones. In Saint-Bertrand de Comminges, the first basilica was a long, narrow hall with columns, likely used for trade. Shops were added later. The basilica in Alesia was probably from the 2nd century, influenced by the Basilica Ulpia. Glanum's Forum and Basilica were simpler. The Forum had no temple access due to space limits, and public buildings lined the valley road. Its pre-Roman Bouleuterion had 3 sides of seating steps, and its basilica was a plain rectangular hall with an internal gallery opening to the Forum. In Arles, the vaulted underground structures of a monumental 2-story portico can still be seen next to a main street. Each side of the portico had 2 parallel vaulted corridors, separated by arches resting on large stone columns. The upper vaults had openings that let light in from the central courtyard. In late antiquity, possibly during Constantine's time, a temple was added on the northern side, set at an angle. Near this area, many imperial statues and inscriptions were found buried, likely after a major disaster. This space is almost certainly the city forum. Similar underground corridors, called cryptoporticus, also exist in Reims, Durocortorum, Bavae, Bagacum, and Aosta. In Aosta, they surrounded an area that had one large and two small temples, and like in Arles, one side opened onto a street. We know more about religious buildings. Two of the best-known monuments are the Maison Carrée in Nîmes and the Temple of Augustus and Livia in Vienne. Both were official buildings from Augustus' lifetime and are fully classical in design and construction. They are six-column temples on high platforms. The Maison Carrée is pseudo-peripteral, columns only on the front and sides, while the Vienne temple is peripteral without columns at the back, a common Roman Republican style. The influence of Rome is seen in the Corinthian capitals and carved walls of the Maison Carrée. These details seem to come from architects who worked on the Temple of Mars Ultor. The decorated frieze resembles the one on the Ara Pacis, Augustus's peace altar. The Vienne temple has more local touches, like its column bases, which match late Republican Italian and early provincial buildings. But overall, it follows Roman architecture. In Narbonne, we see how such influences reached the provinces. The remains of the Capitolium there show it was a very large temple, 48 by 36 meters, double the size of the Maison Carrée. It was placed at the far end of a long, narrow, double-porticoed space, making it look even more impressive. The structure had 8 front columns, a pseudo-peripteral layout, and 3 inner chambers, cellae. It was made entirely from Carrara marble. A sunken Roman ship found off the coast of Saint-Tropez carried rough-cut columns and other marble parts that match this temple in size and type. These pieces haven't been found elsewhere, suggesting they were meant for Narbonne, but never arrived. As seen in Augustan Rome, using new materials and techniques usually meant bringing in foreign workers and new artistic ideas. This seems to have happened in Narbonne, too. These official classical temples show one side of architecture. Along with strong Italian influences, there was also a persistent local tradition in Gaul that helped shape a unique Gallo-Roman style. Outside of the imperial cult or city-sponsored temples like the Capitolium, religious Romanization mostly meant giving Roman names and traits to local gods. These deities and their sacred spaces remained important in everyday life for the Gallic people. Many of these sacred places were in open natural areas, often near springs or special landscape features. They were usually located in or next to large courtyards, suggesting gatherings for festivals or pilgrimages. Around these courtyards, there could be shops, galleries, inns, theaters, and other buildings. One such sacred center was Sanxai, 20 miles southwest of Poitiers, which resembled a small town. Another is the 4th century temple of Nodens at Lydney in England. There, next to the temple, were lodgings for the sick, a well-equipped inn, and a bathhouse. While individual temples differed in detail, their basic shapes were quite consistent. They were usually square, round, or octagonal towers, cellae, with one entrance. Except for the simplest ones, they were surrounded by low-roofed porches. From the 1st to the 4th centuries, such temples were common across Gaul, Britain, and the Rhine region. Simple ones were made of wood. At the other extreme is the Temple of Janus in Autumn, which is 13 meters tall with small stone block walls and brick details. Another, is the Vasuna Temple in Périgueux, built in the 2nd century for the local goddess of the town. It had a tall, round, tower-like cella and was surrounded by a large courtyard and portico. In Provence, such local-style temples disappeared early. Sadly, we don't know what the Temple of Nemesis, the spring god of Nimes, originally looked like. But an early Augustan temple at Vernègue, dedicated to a water god, was fully classical in style. In contrast, the Altbachtal sanctuary at Trier kept over 70 temples unchanged from the 1st to the 4th century. Most were square, some were round. This traditional style lasted longer in rural areas like northern Gaul and Britain. In other regions, Romanization brought changes. At Augusta Raurica, the temples on the hill of Schönbühl stayed in native style until the late 2nd century, then were replaced by classical monuments. The Lenus Mars Temple in Trier is a good example of this change. Sometimes local and classical styles were blended, like at Périgueux, Autun, or the sanctuary of Champlieu in the Compiègne forest. At Champlieu, the temple stood in the middle of a porticoed complex with a theater and bathhouse. It was a square temple on a podium with a small porch at the front, corner pilasters, and half columns on each side. The building was brightly painted. Architecturally and artistically, it combined both Roman and local elements. Theaters in Gaul include some of the earliest examples outside Italy. One striking design is at Fréjus, where the seating and stage front were made of small stone blocks and the upper parts were wooden. The columns may have been wood, covered in plaster or painted. An inscription from Fours mentions a wooden theater later rebuilt in stone, suggesting many stone theaters in Gaul began as wooden ones. The Fréjus theater is unusual in that it was never rebuilt. Some theaters, like in Arles, date back to Augustus or early Julio-Claudian times. The column capitals in Arles combine Doric and Corinthian styles, which is quite early. In Lyon, later changes hide the original design, but the base of the columns points to an early 1st century style, no longer used in Rome. Although it's hard to date precisely with inscriptions, growing evidence shows that by Augustus' reign, theater building in Gaul was following trends set in Rome. Theaters also evolved. Simple stage buildings were replaced by more complex designs, and from the 2nd century onwards, marble started replacing local materials. At Fréjus, the stage wall was flat and had 3 doors framed by a column screen. In Arles, the central door stood within a shallow semicircle with a projecting porch, a design also seen in Aosta. In Orange and Vienne, a central exedra was balanced by 2 side ones. This layout, alternating rounded and flat elements, was typical of Roman stage architecture and created a dramatic visual rhythm. The theaters in Vienne and Orange were built into cliffs. Spectators entered from above, which is rare in Roman theaters. The Vienne theater also has remains of a curved portico at the top of the seating area. From there, like in the Theater of Pompey in Rome, one could see a temple. The best feature of the Orange Theater is its almost fully preserved stage building. Though much of the decoration is gone, its rhythmically spaced posts for the awning structure created a lighter appearance. However, the blind arches on the mid-level are very shallow and don't create the intended effect. The overall look is plain and stiff. This shows that Roman architects, many early amphitheaters in Gaul were mostly made of wood, just like those in northern Italy. In some places, they stayed that way for a long time. Most of the evidence for these wooden structures comes from military areas, but it's clear they were not limited to just military use. Later, in the time of Trajan, much larger wooden structures were built on stone foundations in colonial cities. The best preserved stone amphitheaters are in Arles and Nîmes. These two are so similar that they were likely built around the same time, although the one in Arles may be a little newer. Since we don't have exact dating evidence, these buildings are usually compared with Roman monuments to estimate their age. They clearly follow Roman models. One new feature in these Gallic amphitheaters is the use of pilasters and half columns on the facade that rise vertically with the entablature across the whole structure. This is different from what we see in similar amphitheaters at Verona or Pola, but there's a similar style at the Forum in Brescia from the late 1st century. This detail helps date the amphitheaters in Arles and Nimes to a time after the Colosseum in Rome, which focuses more on horizontal decorative bands. Both likely belong to the late Flavian or Trajanic periods. The vaulted roofs in the upper galleries show influence from the theater of Marcellus, giving a sense of deliberate use of older styles, possibly because the builders lacked confidence in new materials. It's important to remember that technical progress in concrete construction in Rome was not matched in Gaul. This helps explain why we find so few major monuments from the end of the 1st century. When people label every early imperial building as Augustan, it's partly because the rules of provincial architecture were so firmly set in that period. Another important part of Roman material culture was the bathhouse, which became very popular in the colder regions of the north. These spread quickly and widely across the northern provinces. Besides a few remains in large cities like Paris, Cluny, and Poitiers, the only major surviving public baths are in Trier and Arles. These are unique imperial-type baths and are discussed in more detail elsewhere. Still, many smaller public baths were found in both cities and rural areas. While no two layouts are exactly the same, two main styles can be seen. One is a group of rooms clustered around one side of an open palestra, following the Pompeii model. This may have been how Roman-style baths first arrived in Gaul. The other type seems to be a local Gallo-Roman development, with a straight row of frigidarium, tepidarium, and caldarium. These often have a palastra, and sometimes circular rooms used for different purposes. A third group, functionally different, includes the bathhouses found at healing springs. These developed near sacred water sources and combined religious, healing, and social functions, much like the healing sanctuaries found throughout the Roman world. The Temple of Sulis Minerva and baths at Aquae Sulis in Britain are examples of this type. These baths usually had large central pools fed directly by the springs. Typical examples include Evo, Eau Creuse, Royat, Puy-de-Dôme, Badenweiler, Rhine, and Les Fontaines Salées, Yonne. In Amélie-les-Bains, alongside the large pools, there were also small individual bathing rooms. A good example of the Pompeii-type bathhouse is the one at Glanum, built after 45 BCE and redesigned during the Flavian period with an enlarged palastra. The north baths at Saint-Bertrand-de-Comminges in Aquitania are from the 2nd century, but still share many features with Pompeii's central baths. In contrast, the baths next to the Forum match the second type well. These buildings could be simple, like the one next to the sanctuary at Champleaux, or more complex and architecturally ambitious. Notable examples include the baths near Rhodes at Canac, which were like a miniature imperial-type bath with symmetrical design, the single-unit symmetrical baths at Drevant and Verdes, and the twin bath units in large complexes like Villers-les-Vreux, Gisacum, and Alon near Le Mans. When we compare these buildings with baths in Asia Minor or North Africa, or even with early examples in Italy, we see how original Gallo-Roman bath architecture could be. Another group of early public monuments in Provence is the triumphal arches. These are similar to the ones in northern Italy, but stand out because of their rich architectural style and sculpture. The earliest examples are found in Cavaillon and Carpentras. These are followed by the arch at Glanum, dated to 10 to 20 CE, which is a more detailed version of the Aosta arch. For a long time, the Orange Arch was thought to be very early, but we now know it was built after 21 CE during the reign of Tiberius. Still, it is the earliest known example of a triple arch built as a single structure. The Arch of Augustus in the Roman Forum, by contrast, was made of 3 separate arches placed side by side. The Orange Arch is impressive both in its architectural design and in the quality of its sculpture. The way the 4-column facades have cornices that bend inward is similar to the painted architectural styles of Pompeii's Third Style. A closely related monument is the Julii Mausoleum at Glanum. This monument has 4 arches, sits on a richly decorated base, and is topped with a round pavilion with a conical roof. It resembles structures in Italy, like those at Aquileia, Sarsina, and Nettuno. The carved panels on this monument seem inspired by a famous Hellenistic painting. It's hard to say whether it still reflects the artistic influence of nearby Massilia, but it clearly shows the creative energy and sculptural talent present in Augustan Provence. As for early domestic architecture in Gallic towns, we mostly rely on excavations at Glanum and Vaison. Both were modest provincial towns, but they give us a valuable picture of middle-class life in early Imperial Gaul. They also complement each other. Glanum stayed close to its local Hellenistic traditions, while Vaison was a small but wealthy tribal capital that shows clear links to Italian styles. In Glanum, the houses were built around columned courtyards, similar to those in late houses in Delos and Pompeii. These courtyards were usually small and resembled atriums, but were not directly based on them. Atrium-style houses were rare north of the Alps, and when they do appear, they tend to have larger gardens and irregular layouts. A good Gallic example of this kind is the House of the Silver Bust in Vaison. With its baths and fine decoration, it gives us a vivid picture of a wealthy Italian-style townhouse from the late 1st century. Shops facing the street and sidewalk porticos are also typical elements of Gallic town architecture, clearly inspired by Italian urban design. Early villas were usually simple, rectangular, barn-like buildings. They often had wooden frames and were divided inside into living areas, storage, and stables. In many cases, these villas continued from even simpler pre-Roman farmhouses. You can clearly see this transformation at sites in Britain. Lockleys near Welwyn, Park Street near St. Albans, and along the Rhine, Mayenne and Köln-Müngersdorf. From these humble beginnings, villas quickly added a corridor or portico along the long side and moved functional spaces like stables and storage out into the farmyard. These corridors were framed by 2 projecting rooms. One of these rooms might later become a bath area. Though the original design was single-story, towers, basements, or partial second floors became common over time. By around 100 CE, this evolution is clear at Ditchley in Oxfordshire and more detailed at Köln-Müngersdorf. These corridor-style villas naturally evolved into villa complexes, with additional service buildings arranged around 1 or more courtyards. In a way, a courtyard villa is just an expanded version of a corridor villa. But with this change came the adoption of classical architectural features: porticos, courtyards, glass windows, painted plaster, mosaic floors, and central heating. Large examples appear at Nennig on the Mosel River, where the basic farm tradition plan has 2 tower-like wings, a 2-story portico, interior rooms around courtyards, and all focused around a central dining hall, showing strong classical influence. Simpler versions, like the villa at Chedworth in Gloucestershire, date from the early 2nd century. Originally 3 semi-wooden wings at the head of a small valley, later joined into a single plan and updated with inner and outer courtyards, a grand dining hall, reception rooms, and a new bath suite. At their best, these villas are impressive and elegant homes, with high standards of comfort that weren't seen again in Europe until the 19th century. This is the rural world of writers like Ausonius and Sidonius Apollinaris, a world where Visigothic and Frankish leaders would inherit and carry forward notable elements of classical culture into the Middle Ages. This is clearly a local tradition, and alongside Greek colonies on the Black Sea coast, it played a role in the architectural models that emerged around legionary fort towns along the lower Danube. Kings in Serdica, modern Sofia, with its grid plan, rectangular walls, disturbed only by swampy ground in one corner, central forum, and shops, reflect the Western military planning traditions seen in towns like Ratiaria, Huescus, and Novae. But even there, next to the forum, is a closed bouleuterion, council building, in a Greek style. The mid to late 1700s city walls were built with small stones and mortar rubble cores, reinforced by firm brick layers. The footing was made of neatly cut stone. Founded around 106 CE by Trajan, Nicopolis ad Istrum, near modern Vellico Tarnovo, shows another blend of traditions, though here Greek influence is stronger than Roman. The grid layout places the forum, agora, at the crossroads of the main streets. It's a square paved area surrounded by Ionic colonnades. On the north is a basilica-style hall. To the east and south are shops or offices. At the west end, between a rectangular hall, built between 146 to 161 CE and labeled a bouleuterion, and a small enclosed theater, lies a monumental entrance arch. That theater may have been used for public gatherings too. It's impossible to go in depth about all major excavation sites in the region, but some are worth mentioning. In Philippopolis, modern Plovdiv, there is a beautiful stadium. Near Marcianopolis, 15 miles west of Odessos, Varna, are remains of what was likely a wooden amphitheater from Trajan's time. Odessos also has an imperial-style bath building tied to a new aqueduct built in 157 CE. In Oscus, near Pleven, 2 large public baths exist, and at Augusta Traiana, near Stara Zagora, a bathing facility is marked by inscriptions naming its rooms. Among many villas, the rich 2nd century Pera-style villa at Madara, used into the Byzantine era, stands out. Near Stara Zagora is Chatalka, a mixed agricultural residential complex similar to villas in Gaul. Ivailovgrad, near the Turkish border, is noted for its marble-style sculptures and mosaics. Numerous underground tombs, painted and vaulted, also survive. This region remains one of the richest but lesser-known areas of provincial Roman archaeology. Another important pre-Roman building tradition here comes from ancient Greek colonies on the Black Sea coast. Many aspects of the region's architecture reflect a meeting of forms brought by Roman armies and long-standing coastal building traditions tied to Asia Minor and the Aegean. One prominent style is the 2nd century marble-type architecture using marble from the Proconnesos quarries, Marmara Island. Capitals and architectural elements were skillfully copied into local limestone, making them nearly indistinguishable from those in Northwest Asia Minor or Pamphylia. In Nicopolis ad Istrum, most buildings are made from local Hotnitsa limestone, but their decorative styles are clearly marble type or Asiatic. A carving records the presence of a group of stone masons from Nicomedia in Bithynia. In Constanza, Tomis, pieces from Proconnesos, craftsmen exist in building remains dated to 161 to 162 CE. These influences reach inland to Philippopolis, Uescus, and further. Another important connection is the use of mortar-filled rubble walls faced with small square stone courses and reinforced with brick bands. We see this technique in a Severan-era bath at Histria and a harbor warehouse in Constanza. Fired brick was used in both walls and vaults in this area long before the similar technique spread to Western Asia Minor in the 2nd century. This classical architecture persisted into the Byzantine era and naturally centered on Constantinople. In Illyria, along the coast, Roman architecture clearly reflects local conditions. Remains of pre-Roman city walls and generally high-quality carved stone show an enduring late Greek building tradition, which becomes stronger closer to the modern Albania-Greece border. On top of this base, small Roman public buildings with northern Italian influence were built in small towns. In Liburnia to the northwest, you can find a 3-chambered Capitolium at Annona, Nin, a stylish triumphal arch in Asseria, near Benkovac, and a long, narrow basilica with a porticoed forum there. In Zadar, ancient later, there was a freestanding temple, a transverse street, and a forum complex with 2-story porticos, very much like Augusta Raurisa's forum. In Salona, the Roman remains include an amphitheater and a large bath, but these pale when compared to Diocletian's palace in nearby Split. One notable early building is a peristyle, 4-column temple whose plan and decoration closely echo the Augustan temple in Pola. The best preserved and most thoroughly documented remains from the region's southeastern corner are at Doclea, near the border of Albania and Montenegro. There you can still see a rectangular porticoed courtyard with an antice-fronted temple to Diana against one wall, a second smaller freestanding temple of similar design, a large public bath building, mostly rectangular except for a few apses, a peristyle house, and a forum and basilica laid out according to northern Italian models. The basilica is notable because it uses arched passages across its front instead of a flat architrave. If correctly dated to the early 2nd century, this anticipates features later used in the structures at Split and Severan buildings at Lepsis Magna. The buildings of Doclea are built using a local style of carefully cut stone interspersed with mortar-filled rubble cores and bands of small square stone courses. This method corresponds to Roman opus reticulatum and brick-faced concrete, and likely has its origins in northern Italy. Most roofs were wooden, but just over the Albanian border at Butrint, Buthrotum, the Temple of Aesculapius has an interior vaulted roof built of brick, reflecting influences from Asia Minor and northern Greece. During the Roman period, Greece was a country of faded glory, overshadowed by its ancient past. It lacked wealth, but had excellent building materials, skilled stonework, and decorative art traditions. Though admiration for Greek culture occasionally led to impressive new buildings in Athens, Greek architecture under Roman rule was more influential abroad than within its own borders. Still, it's wrong to ignore it completely. Classical Greece remained a key source of inspiration, and its own traditions, whether repetitive or genuinely innovative, tell us much about East-West artistic exchange. We are fortunate that Corinth, the capital of the Achaia province, has been so well documented. Plundered by Mummius in 146 BCE and refounded in 44 BCE, Corinth didn't see major architectural projects right away. The first settlers restored the agora, the Greek central square, some sacred areas, and the large South Stoa from the 4th century BCE. It wasn't until Augustus's reign that the city center began to take on a grander form. Thanks to meticulous American excavations, Corinth serves as an excellent case study of how Roman provincial cities grew and adapted. In the Hellenistic era, the agora had a 150-meter irregular outline. It was bordered on the south by the South Stoa, and on the north by the Piraean Fountain and the smaller Northwest Stoa, both at the foot of Apollo's Hill. A sloping road crossed from the Kentriaion port to Lycaon. Early Roman settlers repaired the fountain and stoas, then reshaped the open area into two flat terraces, the upper terrace for official use and the lower for everyday life. Horses and carts were banned, and the main entrance was from the Lycaean road via stairs. Development was gradual. Under Augustus, the main road and adjacent basilica were formalized. A row of temples, including Hermes's, and a local pantheon appeared by 200 CE. The South Stoa was rebuilt, an increasingly grand Piraean fountain facade was added, and the agora saw its first civic buildings. Claudius and other emperors continued the work. They added markets, shops, a platform for official speakers, bema, a propylon entrance, another temple, and likely a Capitolium temple on high ground near the West Stoa. A new Roman theater replaced the Greek one, and a sheltered peristyle market was built north of Apollo's site. Most structures were built from local limestone, poros, and covered in good plaster until mid-1st century CE. Tiberius introduced changes, such as the Ionic Temple of Tyche and the circular shrine of Cnaeus Babius Philinus, using elegant marble and refined carving, echoing Athens's Erechtheion. Soon after, the Pantheon was rebuilt in white marble, and the bema received marble detailing. During the Flavian emperor's rule, a major earthquake struck in 77 CE. Reconstruction saw marble used regularly in columns, walls, and decoration. The basilica along the main road was rebuilt and widened. Colonnades flanked the road, shops opened off the Apollo courtyard, and a grand entry arch was erected. Vaulted shops replaced the northwest stoa. Marble facades were added to the Capitolium and Hermes Temple. The Glauca fountain got its own colonnaded courtyard. A small Odeon, concert hall, was built near the theater. In the 2nd century, gaps between buildings were filled with the captives facade, and a large bath with toilets was added north of the main road. Public offices and baths were added to the south stoa. The Piraean fountain was redecorated twice, including once under Hadrian. The Odeon was rebuilt by the wealthy Herodes Atticus in the 170s CE. Toward the end of the century, the Western Temple Row was completed by around 200 CE. Shortly before the Greek traveler and writer Pausanias visited, Corinth's center had taken on the final layout that lasted into later Roman times, with only minor changes. These construction phases reflect broader urban patterns across the empire. Like at Leptis Magna in North Africa, city centers were built with clear planning logic, adapting materials, styles, and functions within a fundamentally conservative tradition rooted in Greek origins. You can clearly see in building materials and methods that concrete was used only sparingly and reluctantly in Roman Greece. It mostly appeared in areas directly influenced by late Republican and early Imperial Italy, like temple foundations, the bases of the theater and Odeon, the vaults under the northwest shops, and a 2nd century bath named Eurycles. The Greek legacy is also clear in decorative details, with Ionic and evolved Doric orders used throughout the 1st century, showing strong influence from Attica. Most important is how planning reflects a Greek mindset: orderly but flexible, balanced but not rigidly symmetrical. Market areas were arranged in typical Greek ways, with shops grouped in regular units, clearly inspired by Hellenistic stoa markets. This contrasts sharply with the dense chaos of eastern marketplaces, or the haphazard mix of houses and shops seen in Pompeii, Ostia, or marble trading areas in Rome. This layout came from Greek traditions, although it may have originated from Hellenized southern Italy. For instance, the northern marketplace in Corinth likely goes back to a 4th century BC porticoed market square behind the North Stoa at Miletus harbor. Similar examples existed in Pompeii and even earlier in Sicilian Morgantina. This southern Italian style spread to Rome and North Africa, such as Lepsis Magna around 8 CE. So, while Greek and Roman architectural traditions often blend, it's important to recognize their shared roots. Corinth's early buildings clearly include Italian elements. Reticulated wall construction, rare in Greece, is found in a mausoleum on the Centrii Road. As noted, concrete was used sparingly. Italian influence likely led to the use of the Tuscan order in the early stone Temple of Hermes, and the Augustan porch of the Piraean fountain combined interlocking Doric columns with an Ionic upper level. Rome also influenced the layout. The marble paving of the agora and standardized architectural forms reflect Roman design. For example, the temple with a high podium reached only by stairs reflects Roman style, contrasting with Greek temples, which usually have steps on all sides. The Temple of Tyche mixes both types, a rare early example. Many bathhouses here also follow architectural forms widely exported from Rome to the Hellenistic East. An amphitheater, possibly 3rd century and not yet fully excavated, also fits this category. Amphitheaters were uncommon in the Greek world. 2 Roman building types, basilicas and theaters, are worth describing in more detail. Their structures are not well preserved in Corinth, but we have exceptional archaeological records. Their architectural history shows many features typical of buildings across the Eastern Empire. Basilicas are less significant in this context because they were never common in the Eastern Roman world. Even so, Corinth has 3 basilicas from the early empire, showing strong Italian influence. The earliest and architecturally most significant was built along the Lycaean Road in the late 1st century BC. Its long layout, columned gallery, entrances, and court platform at each end closely resemble the basilica in Pompeii and differ from contemporary Roman basilicas in central or northern Italy, which were often built parallel to and opening onto their forums. That type, found in Ephesus, Smyrna, Berytus, and Cyrene, included columned facades facing the forum. In that sense, stoas in the Eastern Roman world functioned similarly to Western basilicas. The Lycaean Road Basilica shows Corinth's close ties to Campania and southern Italy. About 50 years later, Corinth added 2 more basilicas of the more common transverse type. These stood alone, reached by a single stair and door, making them local, unusual variations, rather than direct Roman imports. The Roman theater in Corinth was built anew on sloping ground, rather than adapting the Greek theater, but both stood one above the other, a helpful comparison. Vitruvius, writing around the 20s BC, clearly explained the key differences between Greek and Roman theaters. Over time, especially in Greek-speaking regions, these differences blurred, but the basic distinctions remained visible. One major difference was how seating and the stage were arranged. In a Greek theater, the orchestra remained a full circle, with the stage building, skene, partially intruding into this circle, and the audience section, cavea, wrapping around more than half the circle. The entrances, parodoi, to the orchestra, were open-air passages at wide angles. In Roman theaters, both the orchestra and cavea are semicircles, and the parodoi are vaulted passageways at stage level, letting seating extend close to the stage. This shift happened during the rebuilding of Pompeii's Great Theater after 80 BC. From then on, Roman theaters were unified designs, with stage and seating integrated within a single enclosure. Another key difference is in the grandness of the stage structure. While Greek and early Hellenistic theaters had large skene buildings that touched the orchestra tangentially, Roman theaters built elevated stages that extended into the orchestra. The stage front, skene frons, was richly decorated with stacked columns and 3 main doors. It was topped by a wooden roof supported by side extensions called paraskenia. Despite variations, most of the empire's surviving theaters, like those in Orange, Aspendos, and Sabratha, share this recognizable Roman stage design. Lastly, Roman theaters offered shelter for spectators during bad weather or breaks in performances. In Greek theaters, shelter would be provided by a separate structure like the Stoa of Eumenes in Athens. In Roman theaters, colonnaded galleries became integral, either as covered walkways above the cavea or as aisles behind the stage building, and often both. Roman theaters evolved into 2 main styles over time, both visible in Corinth. Though details vary, focus remained on the stage. Theaters fall into Eastern and Western types. The Eastern type features a flat facade with 3 grand entrances and columns around it. The Western type emphasizes depth, with an elaborate stage that pushes forward, highlighting the action over the backdrop. These labels aren't perfect. Many theaters in Roman Syria are actually Western despite their East location. The distinction reflects the long-standing Greek theater tradition in regions like Greece and Anatolia versus theaters influenced mainly by southern Italy and Rome. Corinth's theater shows many Western traits. Its Augustan stage remains are limited, but the 2nd century marble stage facade could be almost fully rebuilt. It has 3 deep, curved indentations framing exedras behind a portico, with column decoration that is mostly just ornamental. By contrast, Stobi Theatre in Macedonia is similar in date, but much more traditional. In Corinth's Roman theater, the seating forms more than a 180-degree curve around the stage, following the Greek style, and still has open paradoi, side entrances. The stage front is a flat wall with 5 equally spaced doors set in niches framed by simple pairs of columns. Another major change was how theaters were used. By the 1st century, gladiator fights were taking place in theaters, and by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, many were adapted for events involving animals, especially where amphitheaters were rare, like in the Eastern Empire. In Corinth, by the early 3rd century, the theater was transformed into an arena by removing the stage and front rows and building high walls. This protected the audience and allowed animals to enter from behind, an approach also clearly seen in Cyrene and seen in Hadrian's time at Stobi, where temporary wooden stages could convert the theater into an arena. This trend wasn't limited to the East. Small theater amphitheaters existed in remote parts of Gallia Belgica and Britain. Later, Corinth's arena was converted into a colymbethra, a pool for water shows. This practice likely originated in the East, as early 2nd century Antioch's Daphne suburb shows similar examples. These water spectacles became notorious in late antiquity. Even Ostia's theater was converted this way. The famous mosaics for more cultured entertainment, smaller enclosed theaters or odeons remained. These were used for readings, lectures, and concerts, and were often connected to larger open-air theaters, as at Corinth, Athens, Naples, Pompeii, Lyon, Vienne, and Sicyon in Pamphylia. Odeons often resembled small theaters in plan, like in Nicopolis and Buthrotum. Others had curved seating inside a rectangular outer wall that supported a roof, as at Pompeii, Epidaurus, Termessos. This form may derive from Hellenistic bouleuteria, such as at Miletus. In Gortyna, Crete, A bouleuterion was even converted into an odeon. In Greek regions, some so-called odeons, e.g. at Aphrodisias, Ephesus, Ptolemais in Cyrenaica, were probably bouleuteria or served dual roles. In northern areas, the larger roofed rectangular form was less common due to climate. The largest known example is in Athens, built by Herodes Atticus, who also rebuilt the Odeon at Corinth. That Odeon held about 3,000 people and followed ordinary theater layout, with a simple rectangular stage typical of Odeons. After a fire around the 3rd century, it too was turned into a small arena. Summing up Corinth's Roman monuments, though Italy provided most architectural influence, other connections played a role too. The early 1st century colonnaded Lycaean street likely reflects East Mediterranean trade links, especially with the Levant. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, dramatic new building trends common in Anatolia and Syria had become widespread, but Corinth adopted them unusually early. These styles were usually found only in coastal Syrian cities until later. The impact of Roman period Anatolia on Corinth remains surprisingly limited. One possible example is the captives facade on the north side of the lower agora, which may serve as a stage backdrop. However, even here, decorative caryatid columns reflect inspiration from Athens rather than Anatolian cities. In cities like Corinth, which had been rebuilt or newly founded, rural life continued strongly. Athens, however, did not. Looted in 86 BC and weakened by civil wars, Athens only fully recovered under Hadrian, but even then, it could never escape the shadow of its glorious past. Students from across the empire came to Athens for education, and emperors or wealthy patrons could add grand new buildings. But living architectural traditions no longer thrived. What persisted was intellectual curiosity and craftsmanship. Artisans could dismantle an old monument block by block, copy classical masterpieces, produce decorative sculptures, or create a unique series of Attic-style sarcophagi. It makes sense that Athens under Roman rule showed many different architectural styles. The first Roman buildings in Athens were by architects like Decimus Casutius, who worked on the Olympieion, Temple of Zeus, between 174 to 164 BC. But the real start of notable Roman projects in Athens came from private Roman patrons. One such person was Appius Claudius Pulcher, a friend of Cicero, who funded the inner propylaea at Eleusis around 50 to 48 BC. His building combined Doric and Ionic styles, had carved Corinthian capitals, and featured statues inspired by the caryatids of the Erechtheion. On the Acropolis, the small round Temple of Rome and Augustus from that time also referred heavily to Erechtheion styles, showing how Athenians admired their classical past. These buildings mixed traditional Athenian style with innovation, though the Caesar and Augustus market, 12 to 2 BC, was more straightforward. It was a large paved courtyard, about 82 by 69 meters, surrounded by Ionic colonnades. Shops were behind the short sides, and the long sides had covered stalls. The south side had a fountain, and outside the east entrance were market offices, a public toilet, and the Tower of the Winds. The main entrance was on the west and faced the agora, built in Doric style with classical details. Some materials may have been repurposed from older temples, like parts from temples at Sunion and Thorikos. This shows how the Romans in Athens used classical resources, sometimes out of respect, other times out of necessity. The most impressive monument of the Augustan period in Athens was Agrippa's large Odeon, built around 15 BC beside Ptolemy's Gymnasium. It sat in the center of the South Agora, overlooking the Panathenaic Way. From the outside, it looked like a tall rectangular hall above a circular structure. Three sides had external galleries, and the stage building sat lower to the north. The main entrance to the hall was south. Inside, the hall was nearly square, with a stage and seating. The orchestra height was nearly the same as the roof, giving a grand feel. The seating slope was gentle, ending at gallery level. The hall could hold roughly 1,000 viewers. Interior decoration focused on the stage and orchestra with colorful marble, carved friezes, and classical details. The exterior walls had pilasters set on large rectangular buttresses, Corinthian pilasters, and a colonnade above on the south. Capitals varied between Corinthian and lotus acanthus designs, similar to those on the Tower of the Winds. Windows were likely small, but most light came from above and behind the audience, illuminating the stage. This building was impressive and unlike anything previously in Athens. Its craftsmanship was Athenian, but its design was new. Even the older Pericles Odeon, rebuilt traditionally after restoration, was considered visually poor. Agrippa's Odeon shared many features with later Eastern Mediterranean buildings, such as the two-tiered Miletus Bouleuterion and Pompeii's indoor theater. It likely served as a model for later halls. Agrippa's Odeon was a foreign-looking addition to Athens, blending late Hellenistic architectural ideas seen in southern and central Italy. While Athens borrowed many decorative motifs from Attica and Erechtheion, the Odeon's overall form was new to Athens. Agrippa's direct involvement in Athenian construction highlights the strong flow of ideas and craftsmen between Italy and Greece. There was also a reverse flow, materials and skills moving east. During most of the 1st century AD, few new buildings were built in Athens except for Nero's renovation of the Theater of Dionysus, which updated the stage but kept much of the traditional layout. In the 2nd and early 3rd centuries, Athens saw renewed building activity and economic growth. Attic craftsmanship and imported materials thrived. Hadrian built a new aqueduct and extended the city's borders east. Many new houses, baths, and gymnasia appeared, proving this expansion was real. The main monument in the new area was the Olympieion, completed in 132 AD, over 700 years after it was first conceived. It echoed similar long-term projects elsewhere in the ancient world. Another early 2nd century monument in the new area was a triumphal arch marking the old and new city boundary. Its unique design combined conservative elements, like the Eleusis Propylaea style, with intellectual ambition. It had columns on both levels, possibly with statues of Theseus and Hadrian above. This two-layered design reminded people of Hadrian's library in Athens, creating a harmonious visual effect. It used arch material like Miletus, but with greater elegance. Its deliberate mix of support columns and recessed archway showed a Baroque-like complexity. Hadrian's Stoa and library in Athens occupied a rectangular space next to the Caesar and Augustus market. The design closely mirrored the Temple of Peace in Rome, a long columned garden court aligned on a symmetrical axis, with large rooms opposite the entrance and small exedras along the sides, and a long pool at the center. Instead of a temple, a library was placed at the front, eliminating the need for a portico. Today, one column remains from the four-columned entrance, reaching up to the cornice. The facade resembled a simplified, extended version of the style seen at Rome's Forum Transitorium, likely topped by a plain attic that once displayed statues. Careful balance of design elements is evident. Green Cipollino columns from Euboea and around 100 Pavonazzetto columns from Phrygia reflect contemporary Roman taste. The elevated podium beneath the building, separate from the main wall, is a distinctly Roman feature, unusual in Western architecture before Christianity, but common in the Eastern Empire. Decorative drawing patterns in the stonework, while rare in early Imperial Rome, were widespread in Asia Minor. None of these features were native to Athens, nor were they unique to later cities like Lepsis Magna. These buildings mark the early signs of a unified Imperial Roman architectural style, emerging across prosperous provinces as regional differences began to fade. Following Hadrian, Athenian architecture was heavily influenced by the wealthy patron Herodes Atticus. In 143 to 144 AD, he funded the restoration of Athens' stadium with Pentelic marble, built an Odeon in Corinth, rebuilt the Perrine fountain, constructed an elegant fountain at Olympia's Altis, and, later in life, built a large outdoor Odeon in Athens that still stands today. Olympia's Nymphaeum, nearly fully preserved, includes sculptures honoring its benefactor, making reconstruction highly accurate. Herodes' Nymphaeum featured a raised semicircular exedra and pool. It had two-tiered niches framed like small temple fronts, housing statues of the imperial family. His and his wife's statues flanked the exedra, with a long rectangular pool below. Two small round tempiettos with conical roofs stood at each end. These familiar elements matched those added to the Athens Agora after Hadrian's aqueduct was completed in 140 AD. An apsidal nymphaeum, and one of the earliest brick-domed fountain buildings in Greece. Combining known forms in new ways became typical of mid-2nd century Greek architecture. Herodes' Odeon in Athens was more restrained but equally eclectic. It had a square plan and a simple stage, yet seated 5,000 people under a 38-meter-wide hemispherical roof without internal supports, a major engineering achievement. The layout closely followed classical Greek theater structures, and the stage facade echoed the skene fronds of Roman theaters, with 3 doors and 8 niches framed by columns or temple fronts. A striking feature was its 2 rows of round arched windows, which added rhythm and contrast to the plain exterior. Athens was ransacked by the Heruli in 267 AD, and even before then, large-scale construction had slowed after the late 2nd century. Across southern Greece, little was built until late antiquity, when Thessaloniki briefly became the capital. Athens didn't regrow architecturally until the 4th and 5th centuries. Outside Corinth and Athens, Philippi in Macedonia is the only systematically excavated city. Originally founded by Philip II, the surviving ruins date to the Roman military colony established in 42 BC and expanded under Augustus in 30 BC. The Agora, set on terraced land near the Acropolis, was remodeled in the 2nd century into a Greco-Roman city center. This marble-paved rectangular space, about 45 by 90 meters, had stoas with shops, offices, and a public library on 3 sides, plus 2 small temples at the narrow ends. The Bouleuterion sat inside one temple. Built between 161 to 179 AD, this layout replaced earlier, less regular planning. Excavations also uncovered a long, linear bath complex, an exceptionally preserved public latrine, and a Roman theater built atop an earlier Greek one. Like many Eastern theaters, it was converted into an arena in the 3rd century. Blue local marble was widely used in building the city, linking it stylistically to workshops in Bithynia and Western Anatolia. Similar architectural style unity can be seen in early imperial remains at Thessaloniki. Both cities lay on the Via Egnatia, the major road connecting Italy to Anatolia, shaping their late imperial and early Byzantine architecture. Other Roman ruins are scattered across Greece, most not extensively studied. One notable example is a recently excavated nymphaeum in Argos, Peloponnese. Carved columns around a conical, fish-scale roofed circular building date it to the 2nd half of the 2nd century, making it contemporary with Herodes Atticus' fountain at Olympia and the early brick-domed fountain in the Athens Agora. Finally, more than half the luxury marbles used in Roman-era ornamentation, pavements, walls, columns, sculptures, came from Greek quarries. These included brilliant white marble from Attica, red marble and green porphyry from Laconia, green cipollino from Charistos in Euboea, ancient green marble from Thessaly, and Parian, Chian, Skirion, teen black and brown marbles, and translucent gray teos marble from the Aegean. Often, Greek craftsmen traveled with these stones, helping spread Greek decorative styles wherever they worked. Asia Minor, together with mainland Greece, had a rich classical heritage. But there were important differences between the two regions. In Greece, Roman architecture was influenced by the prestige of classical Athenian monuments. In Asia Minor, however, the dominant architectural tradition was the Ionic style, especially seen in the works of Hermogenes. While Athens had become an old and respected city, Hellenistic kingdoms like Pergamon were still active and creative centers. Despite a century of piracy, civil wars, and poor governance, Asia Minor remained a wealthy region. Cities like Ephesus were among the largest in the Roman world, and many towns across Asia Minor experienced a level of prosperity unmatched before or after. While Greece had lost its creative energy, Asia Minor remained a lively and strong center of Greek traditions. Positioned between Rome and the ancient East, this region would later play a growing role in the development of late Roman architecture. Asia Minor was full of quality building stones and marble, and still had plenty of timber during Roman times. These materials were the foundation of monumental architecture. Many cities such as Hierapolis, Assos, and Alexandria Troas followed this building tradition into the Byzantine era. Even in the 6th century, large vaulted buildings like Hagia Sophia in Constantinople or the Church of St. John in Ephesus used large stone blocks for their columns, showing that this tradition continued. However, starting in the time of Augustus, a new material began to compete with cut stone. This material was similar to Roman concrete from Italy, although it did not have the same strength or waterproof qualities provided by volcanic sand from regions like Latium and Campania. It was made from layers of rubble set in thick lime mortar and then covered with a finer surface layer. This construction method looked different from Roman concrete, especially due to the surface treatment. Italian techniques like the reticulated facing were rare here. Instead, builders used local materials in the best way possible. For example, in Miletus, river stones and pebbles were hard to work with, so the surface looked rough. In Cilicia, volcanic basalt allowed for more irregular stonework, but in places where stone could be shaped easily, it was cut into small rectangular blocks and laid in a method similar to the Gallic petit appareil. In this method, the facing stones aligned precisely with the inner core, and larger blocks were used at the corners and around doors and windows. The earliest known use of this technique can be seen in the aqueduct built between AD 4 to 14 by Caius Sextilius Pollio in Ephesus. By the middle of the 1st century, it had become a standard technique in cities along the western coast. In Miletus, from the Claudian baths built by Gnaeus Virgilius Capito to the Trajanic Humetepi baths, aqueducts, and the substructures of the great Nymphaeum, and finally the Baths of Faustina in the mid-2nd century, this method was applied more and more skillfully. This early and wide use is no coincidence. In Italy, concrete first proved its worth in large vaulted buildings like baths, terraces, theaters, and amphitheaters, some of Rome's most original contributions to Hellenistic architecture. But beyond appearances, there was a key difference between this stone and mortar system and Roman concrete. The mortar in Asia Minor was not strong enough to support large vaults in the Roman style. Vaults, half domes, and full domes had to be built using stone slabs arranged like bricks in a radial pattern. These types of vaults appear in all the Miletus buildings mentioned above. But just like in Republican Rome, these vaults stood not because of strong mortar, but because of careful stone placement. Only in places like Cilicia, where volcanic sand similar to that in Rome was available, did mortars reach a strength close to Roman concrete. This led to a clear result. The concrete buildings constructed in Rome in the late 1st century AD, described in earlier sections, could not be directly copied in Asia Minor or other parts of the East. Although these buildings represented the most advanced architecture of their time and would influence the whole Roman world, this influence would not come through direct imitation, but through more indirect forms. In Asia Minor, especially due to the limitations in vault construction, there was a need for a material that was more flexible than stone and mortar, but still easier to shape. That material was fired brick. Although bricks were used in classical times in Asia Minor, few examples survive in archaeological records. Sun-dried mud brick was known in both Greek and Roman architecture, but remains survive only in dry areas. Fired brick, on the other hand, is nearly indestructible, which is why later generations often removed it from ancient buildings for reuse. In Asia Minor, both the climate and the practice of dismantling old buildings have made surviving examples of brick structures quite rare. It is not possible to confirm with certainty that sun-dried mud brick was used for building vaults in Asia Minor. However, we know that this technique existed in Roman Egypt and Syria, and a few examples, such as the vault under the Basilica at Aspendos in Pamphylia, suggest a connection to Near Eastern mud brick traditions. This supports the idea that brick vaulting in Asia Minor, when it comes to fired brick, we have more solid evidence. This material likely reached Asia Minor in the early 2nd century, either directly from Italy or through Thrace, and was used by that time in the upper floor of the library at Ephesus. To understand how it was used, we can look at two important monuments in Roman Pergamon. The first is the Serapeum, also known as the Red Courtyard. Some of its side buildings were made of rubble covered in small, regular stone blocks, but the large central hall was built entirely of brick. While this may look similar to Roman brick buildings, there is a major difference. In Rome, the core of buildings was usually concrete or rubble, while here the entire structure was made from mortar-bonded brick. This method was also used in the upper parts of the bath complex at Ephesus and in the pressure towers of the 3rd century aqueduct at Aspendos. The second important example in Pergamon is the Temple of Asclepios Soter, built in the 130s AD. This temple was one of the most prestigious monuments of its time and was designed with reference to the Pantheon, built about a decade earlier. However, instead of the carefully layered Roman concrete used in the Pantheon, the temple's drum was made of finely cut stone blocks, and the dome was built from bricks placed in a radial pattern. The base of the dome was strengthened by an outer ring of rubble masonry, faced with small stones and supported by large corner blocks. A nearby semi-buried rotunda was built in the same style. This structure shows how Roman architectural ideas were combined with local building traditions. It used brick for vaulting and treated rubble masonry as a local version of Roman concrete. This demonstrates how different building traditions came together in Roman Asia Minor. Another use of brick deserves mention: a wall design where layers of brick alternate with wider bands of mortar-filled rubble. This technique, which appeared in the 2nd century, was adopted by Byzantine architects and later became a classic feature of Constantinople's Theodosian land walls. A Roman-era example of this can be found in the city walls of Nicaea, modern Iznik, built between 258 and 269. Though this may resemble the opus mixtum system from central Italy, combining brick and stone, it is more similar to the petit appareil stone technique found in some European provinces. In this system, the bricks not only covered the surface, but also extended into the core to strengthen the structure and give it stability. Asia Minor is a large and difficult region to travel through, so it's helpful to divide its Roman-era monuments into 3 zones: the inland plateau, the valleys and plains along the western coast, and the southern coastal areas of Pamphylia and Cilicia. Among these, the inland plateau had the least importance in Roman times due to its limited access to the coast and a classical civilization. If more remains had survived from once thriving centers like Konya, ancient Iconium, we might have a clearer picture of the architecture in the provinces of Galatia and Cappadocia. As it is, the few surviving structures suggest a provincial architectural style. The one major exception is Ankara, ancient Ancyra, the capital of Galatia and an important road hub, where 2 significant monuments still stand. One of them is the Temple of Roma and Augustus, which contains the best-preserved text of the Res Gestae Divi Augusti. This was a large temple with 8 columns and a false dipteral layout. The preserved parts of the cella are so close in style to Hermogenes that some researchers date it to the 2nd century BC. However, the external Corinthian columns and other features are too distinct from Hellenistic craftsmanship, suggesting it was a product of a still living tradition, possibly inspired by the Temple of Mars Ultor in the Forum of Augustus in Rome. The second major structure in Ankara is a large bath complex with multiple heated rooms, likely built during the reign of Caracalla, 211 to 217. It had a grand rectangular plan, symmetrical around its short axis. On the west end was a projecting apse, and on the east, a large swimming pool, natatio, near the entrance. In front of this pool was a massive colonnaded courtyard. The entire building was constructed with mortar-filled rubble faced with small square stones, and brick courses were placed between the stone layers. Brick was also used in the vaults of channels and staircases, and possibly in the small rooms, though the main roofs were probably wooden. While the temple followed Hellenistic traditions, the bathhouse reflected a completely Western architectural style, both in design and social function. The city of Antioch in Pisidia was founded as a Roman colony shortly after 25 BC to control the mountain tribes at the southwestern edge of the plateau. Although originally a Hellenistic town, evident in its grid street plan, the surviving structures date from the Roman period. The colony did not maintain its initial prosperity and settled into a modest level of wealth. This allowed early Roman influence to be seen more clearly than in other cities. The main excavated monument is a temple likely dedicated to Augustus and possibly linked to the local god-men. It was built on a raised terrace with a large semicircular platform at the back. Around this semicircle was a 2-storied colonnade with Doric columns below and Ionic above. The temple's main axis was extended downhill during the reign of Tiberius, creating a dramatic entrance aligned with the main road. This kind of urban planning was entirely Roman, and the temple itself, unlike the one in Ankara, was fully Roman in style, raised on a podium with a 4-column front and a staircase. While its decorations borrowed from late Hellenistic motifs, it also featured bullheads and acanthus wreaths, common in Western designs of the time. The temple's details and craftsmanship show strong Roman influence. Other monuments in the city include a well-built aqueduct from the time of Augustus, an unexcavated theater, a large vaulted platform made from mortar rubble faced with dressed stones, later reused for another building, and a monumental arch from the early 3rd century. This last structure combines early imperial motifs with decorative elements from contemporary marble architecture on the coast, making it a rather awkward blend that reflects how Baroque taste was misunderstood in the provinces. The western coast of Asia Minor had long been the traditional heart of classical civilization in the region. During the Roman period, it remained the main center of creative energy, along with Bithynia, which included the southern and eastern shores of the Sea of Marmara. Cities such as Ephesus, Pergamon, Aphrodisias, Tralles, Hierapolis in Caria, and Cyzicus and Nicaea in Bithynia preserved many features of their Hellenistic past in their Roman-era architecture. Even though the general design ideas were conservative, these buildings often showed a strong spirit of experimentation. Innovations in planning, decoration, and construction techniques were blended with established traditions, keeping the artistic language familiar. This balance made Western Asia Minor's architecture an important influence on the tastes of the late antique period. One only needs to compare the monuments of Ephesus with the more lifeless and antique-focused buildings in contemporary Athens to see the energy and creativity present. In both architecture and other cultural areas, the cities of Asia Minor remained lively carriers of Hellenistic tradition. Among the three major archaeological sites, Ephesus, Miletus, and Pergamon, the most important in Roman times was Ephesus, the capital of the province of Asia and the main port for all southwestern Anatolia. The area near the harbor had been carefully planned shortly after 300 BC by Lysimachus, but the steep slopes in the center of the city disrupted this layout, making the site archaeologically complex. Ephesus is one of the most fascinating ancient cities to visit, but its highly imaginative architectural style makes it harder to categorize compared to more traditional centers. In contrast, Roman Miletus lacked this forward-thinking spirit. It remained strictly tied to the rectangular street plan designed by Hippodamos in the 5th century BC, and the details of its buildings reflected a sense of conservatism, suggesting the city had passed its prime. Pergamon developed differently. Its Roman-era growth took place on the flat land at the foot of the Acropolis, where the earlier Hellenistic monuments were located. Beyond these three cities, we only have scattered information about urban planning in other settlements. Aphrodisias, built on flat terrain, seems to have had a city center organized around public monuments and large columned open spaces, apart from its well-preserved theater built into the slope of an earlier mound. This layout resembled the rectangular city center of Miletus. In Knidos, the terraced city plan of the Roman period closely followed that of the Hellenistic era. Nicaea's layout was especially admired. It was divided into 4 equal parts by 2 broad intersecting streets. Looking more closely at individual monuments, it is clear that 2 different architectural traditions shaped the region. In some areas, local Hellenistic styles remained dominant for a long time, while in others, where local examples were lacking, architects had to look to Italy for inspiration. The architectural history of Western Asia Minor was largely shaped by the development and interaction of these 2 traditions. Religious architecture clearly followed local traditions. The cities of the province of Asia were already filled with well-built temples, so architects naturally turned to the great sanctuaries of the Hellenistic era when planning new temples. The most common model was the one represented by the works of Hermogenes, a 2nd century BC architect. This influence can also be seen in the temple built in Ancyra during the time of Augustus. The Temple of Titus, also called the Temple of Domitian, in Ephesus follows a similar plan, except that it does not have a back room. The Temple of Aphrodite in Aphrodisias was also an Ionic temple with 8 columns, though its exact date is still uncertain. The walls of its cella were later incorporated into a Christian apse, and the stonework clearly reflects this traditional style. Another example from this tradition is the Temple of Zeus in Aizanoi, completed around AD 125. It is closely related to the Temple of Hadrian in Kyzikos, the last and most ambitious structure in the series. Completed in AD 139, the Kyzikos temple was damaged soon after by an earthquake and rededicated in AD 167. Today, it appears as a pile of rubble overgrown with shrubs. But in the 15th century, the traveler Cyriacus of Ancona saw and described it, with half of it still standing. According to him, the podium measured about 30 by 60 meters, and the building was a peripteral temple in the Corinthian order, with 8 columns at the front and 15 along each long side. The columns and cella walls were about 21 meters tall, 3 meters taller than those of the Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek. Even if Cyriacus's measurements were slightly off, this was clearly a massive monument. It featured richly carved friezes, vine-patterned columns, finely detailed doors, and a bust of Hadrian in the pediment. This last detail is reminiscent of the shield-shaped relief of Antoninus Pius on the outer gate at Eleusis. The temple also included, at an unknown location, columns supporting a carved arch instead of a straight architrave, possibly the first known example of this design in monumental architecture, with the next similar case appearing in Lepsis Magna in North Africa. Another important temple was the Trajaneum in Pergamon, dedicated to Zeus Philios and the Emperor Trajan. This temple stood in a dramatic location at the top of the ancient Acropolis, facing the theater. It was surrounded on 3 sides by a rectangular courtyard lined with colonnades. The temple itself had 6 columns and was built in the Corinthian style. Unlike earlier examples, it stood on a Roman-style podium. Inside the cella was a front chamber with 2 interior columns, and the corners of the building featured flat pilasters. Notable features include carved roof ornaments, acroteria, similar to those on the Temple of Artemis Leucophryane in Magnesia by Hermogenes, as well as large Medusa heads and grooved triglyph-like motifs in the frieze. These decorative elements also appear in early examples of the new marble architecture that emerged during the reign of Hadrian, OD 117 to 138, in places like Side. It is believed that the architect of the Temple of Venus and Roma in Rome may have previously worked on the Trajaneum. This temple was clearly a well-known and influential monument. From the beginning, 2 main architectural influences can be seen in the individual buildings of Western Asia Minor. In some areas, local Hellenistic traditions remained strong for a long time. In other areas, where local examples were lacking, architects had to look to Italy for inspiration. The architectural history of Western Anatolia during the first 3 centuries AD is mostly shaped by the development and interaction of these 2 traditions. Religious architecture clearly followed the local style. Cities in the province of Asia were already filled with well-built temples made from durable materials, so when new temples were constructed, architects naturally looked back to the great sanctuaries of the Hellenistic period. The most popular model was the one represented by the works of Hermogenes, a famous architect from the 2nd century BC. This can also be seen in the Temple of Augustus in Ancyra. The Temple of Titus in Ephesus, sometimes identified with Domitian, follows Hermogenes' design, except it does not include a rear room. The Temple of Aphrodite at Aphrodisias was an Ionic-style building with 8 columns. The surviving cella wall, now part of a Christian apse, still shows the same kind of characteristic stonework. The Temple of Zeus at Aizanoi, completed around AD 125, belongs to this same tradition and seems to have paved the way for larger and more decorative temples like the Temple of Hadrian. The Temple of Hadrian at Cyzicus was completed in AD 139, but damaged shortly after by an earthquake. However, when Cyriacus of Ancona visited in the 15th century, part of it was still standing. The temple was around 30 by 60 meters in size, with 8 columns on the short sides and 15 on the long sides. It had a Corinthian design, and the cella walls stood 21 meters high, taller than the famous Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek. The rich decorations included vine reliefs, sculpted friezes, ornate doors, and a bust of Hadrian in the pediment. Its facade, where columns supported an arched entablature rather than a flat one, is considered the first clear example of this type of design in monumental architecture. Another impressive temple was the Trajaneum in Pergamon, dedicated to Zeus Philios and Emperor Trajan. Built on the top of the ancient Acropolis and facing the theater, the temple was surrounded on 3 sides by columned galleries forming a rectangular courtyard. It was a 6-column Corinthian peripteral temple raised on a Roman-style podium. At the corners of the front were flattened pilasters, and the frieze featured large Medusa heads, decorations typical of the new marble architectural style that began during Hadrian's time. It's believed this temple may have influenced the architect of the Temple of Venus and Roma in Rome, which shows how admired and influential the Trajaneum was. The temple likely had a square skylight in the ceiling. Its decorative elements followed techniques popular in the late Hellenistic period and were revived in this context. For example, the bases that added height to the lower columns would become a long-lasting feature in late antique and early Christian architecture. The carved facade at Ephesus is a prime example of this decorative style. The columns on the upper story are offset from those below, creating a layered appearance. Alternating triangular and sloped pediments are another signature feature of this design. Unlike theaters and temples, the Roman-style amphitheater never became common in the Eastern Mediterranean. The few exceptions, like those at Pergamon, Cyzicus, and Anazarbos in Cilicia, stand out. In most cases, theaters or stadiums, such as those at Aphrodisias and Laodicea, were adapted for similar uses. Western Anatolia already had many theaters, and most were remodeled in the Roman period. 2 typical examples help explain the differences. The theater at Ephesus, built into a steep hillside, had an impressive audience capacity of about 24,000 people. The stage building was restored during the reign of Domitian, AD 81 to 96. Although the general layout was still Greek in style, the stage building was structurally separate from the seating area. In design, the stage wall closely resembled the theater at Aspendos, with 2 levels of columns framing 5 doorways. This similarity suggests that Aspendos may have been modeled after the Ephesus theater. Around AD 200, a 3rd level was added, which was more simply designed and slightly set back from the lower ones. Since there were no side rooms, periskania, the stage roof was likely not enclosed. In contrast, the theater at Miletus had been fully transformed into a Roman-style building. The seating and stage areas were enlarged and extended upward and outward with arched substructures. The stage building had a 3-level Roman-style facade, side rooms, and a roof. Unlike the typical Roman 3-niche pattern, this theater had one large, shallow, curved niche in the center, with 4 freestanding columns placed in front of it. The decorative style was a deliberate mixture of elements, similar to what is seen in the Celsus Library in Ephesus. Bath buildings played a key role in spreading Roman construction techniques, as noted earlier. However, bathhouses in Asia Minor were not direct copies of Italian ones. They were adapted to local materials, construction traditions, and social customs. One major difference was the long-standing gymnasium tradition from the Hellenistic period. In Italy, gymnasiums and bathhouses had already been combined, but in Asia Minor, architects had to find a new way to merge the two. Unlike earlier Roman baths from the late Republic or Augustan period, these newer ones were more advanced and ambitious. Some of the best examples of this new design can be found in Ephesus. The best documented structure is the bath built by Publius Vedius Antoninus, a wealthy friend of Emperor Antoninus Pius, reigned 138 to 161. Located north of the stadium, the complex covered a rectangular area measuring 76 by 130 meters from east to west. The bathhouse was on the west side, while the east side contained an open courtyard, palestra, surrounded by columns. Elements from the bathhouse and the palestra extended outward to form a grand H-shaped colonnaded corridor. This included the bath pool and a richly decorated rectangular hall known as the Marble Hall or Kaisersaal, which opened onto the western portico of the palestra. This hall had an open front, double rows of columns, and was decorated with statues. The corridor itself was built with arches made from stone, brick, or rubble vaults, and rested on stone supports. A simpler version of this layout also appears in the Faustina Baths at Miletus. Like all Ephesus baths, the main bathing block was designed with a precise rectangular plan. The central hot room, caldarium, may have followed the layout usually used for cold rooms, frigidaria, in the capital, but was built using local materials and vaulting techniques. The outer surfaces of the vaults were likely left exposed, as seen in Miletus. The theater baths, dated to the early 2nd century, had a similar arrangement, but with the bathing block reversed so the hot rooms were directly next to the palestra. The H-shaped monumental corridor was placed beyond the bath, with an additional space behind it aligned with the marble hall. This unusual layout was never repeated elsewhere. The most remarkable and informative complex in Ephesus is located north of the Arcadian. It consisted of 3 main parts. In the west, the large and impressive harbor baths from the 2nd century. In the center, a large colonnaded courtyard where 2 marble halls faced each other. And in the east, an open area measuring about 220 by 260 yards. This space, surrounded by multiple columned porticos, resembles the enclosed running tracks, zistoi, of the late Hellenistic period. The non-bath parts of the complex may date to the time of Domitian, AD 81 to 96, and are believed to have housed the Hellenistic gymnasium mentioned by the writer Strabo. The bath structure may have replaced an earlier, simpler facility. The east baths near the Magnesia Gate in Ephesus had a similar layout to earlier complexes. The bath building dates to the early 2nd century, while the gymnasium and palestra appear to have been rebuilt during the reign of the Severan emperors, 1933 to 211. The general plan closely resembles that of the harbor complex, but in this case, the hall opposite the Marble Hall was clearly designed as a conference room, with raised seating along 3 interior walls. An inscription in the dedication of Vedius's complex refers to the building as a gymnasium, and similar inscriptions have also been found in the harbor complex. But even without such inscriptions, it's easy to see that these buildings evolved from both the Hellenistic gymnasium and the Roman bathhouse. The balance between these 2 elements also shifted over time. In the Domitian-era complex, the palestra and training spaces covered about 2/3 of the total area, while by the time of the East Baths, a century later, they occupied only about 1/4. Architecturally, the bath structure became the dominant part of the complex, though it never fully replaced the other functions. The Hellenistic gymnasium was not just a place for physical training. It also served as a center for education. The arts, youth organizations, and semi-aristocratic clubs that played important roles in city life. In Italy, some of these activities moved to other venues, while others were naturally absorbed into the public bath system. A similar process occurred in Asia Minor. For example, the layout and position of the marble hall in Vedius's complex closely resemble the Ephebion, or youth classroom, of the Hellenistic gymnasium, even if it also served new purposes such as imperial cult rituals. We can observe the same transformation in Miletus. The baths built by Cnaeus Virgilius Capito during the reign of Claudius, 41 to 54, were constructed on the site of a Hellenistic gymnasium, and part of the original building was preserved as the colonnaded palaestra of the new bathhouse. The Humetepi baths, dated to around AD 100, are a simpler version of this layout, with the gymnasium element reduced to just a columned palaestra. The Faustina baths, built in the mid-2nd century, clearly reflect the same trends seen in contemporary Ephesus. Due to the irregular building site, the complex was divided into separate parts. The bath block consisted of a series of vaulted rooms arranged without symmetry, reflecting the local architectural style of Asia rather than the regular Roman layouts of Ephesus. Some of the earliest examples of vaulting made with mortar, rubble, and brick can also be found here. What's most important about the Miletus baths is that they were constructed in Roman style, with parts made of finely cut stone and others from rubble-filled walls, all using vaulted construction. Especially in the Capito baths, the inclusion of multiple apsidal niches and a round, domed chamber with corner apses closely resembles early bath architecture in the Campania region. Just like at the hunting baths in Lepsis Magna, some of the vaults had curved exteriors that were visible from the outside, something difficult to document in Asia, but indicative of a fresh visual approach, replacing traditional flat roofs and sloped gables. 3 other major bath complexes in Western Asia Minor are also worth noting. One is the Upper Gymnasium in Pergamon. The West Baths date to an early period, mid-1st century, while the East Baths are from Hadrian's reign, 117 to 138, and represent the evolution of a classic Hellenistic gymnasium. On the north side of the palaestra stood an Odeon and 2 exedrae similar to marble halls. These structures were built from mortar rubble and covered with carefully crafted stone facings. On the opposite end of the scale is the vast bath complex built over the hot springs of Hierapolis. It consisted of large vaulted halls built entirely from well-cut stone. Rectangular exedrae, familiar in form, were placed on either side of an open palaestra. One of these may have been used as a library. The baths at Aphrodisias also date to the Hadrianic period and share a similar layout with the harbor complex. At the west end was a large bath block laid out along an east-west axis. In front of it was a small, richly decorated columned courtyard, and beyond that, a long open area measuring 212 by 68 meters, aligned with the agora. This area likely served as a palaestra in later times, though it was built earlier, between AD 14 to 28. Compared to public architecture, domestic architecture in Roman Asia has received much less attention in excavations. One exception is the group of large urban houses decorated with mosaics and wall paintings, located along the street that runs uphill from the agora and library toward the Magnesia Gate in Ephesus. Although these houses appear multi-story due to the terraced slope, this was more a result of the geography than of a design trend. Still, these houses are an important reminder that, unlike in Western provinces, it was rare for wealthy people in Asia Minor to live outside the city. When discussing Western Anatolian cities, it's also important to mention one of the most distinctive and historically significant features of this architectural tradition: marble decoration. Marble was readily available locally in places like Ephesus, the Meander Valley, and Aphrodisias. The Hellenistic period had already developed a strong tradition of decorative craftsmanship, and during the Roman period, this continued and expanded as increased production made marble more affordable. Decorative architecture in Roman Asia remained closely tied to Hellenistic models. Comparing the details of the Trajaneum in Pergamon with the Venus Genetrix temple in Rome, which was built around the same time, shows a clear difference. The Roman building represents a new wave of Western architectural creativity, filled with new motifs and changes to older forms. In Asia, although a more colorful and simplified style developed by the late 2nd century, the core vocabulary of decorative elements remained stable. What changed was how those elements were used. This shift had a major impact on the decorative patterns of imperial architecture in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. While Rome's love for ornamentation showed itself in individual motifs and details, in Asia, this desire was expressed through dramatic architectural forms, especially through columned facades. These facades were essentially Baroque in style because they combined familiar classical elements in unusual and sometimes artificial ways. They resembled the stage buildings of Roman theaters, both originating from luxurious Hellenistic palace designs that had spread widely by the late Hellenistic period. Because many of these early structures were made of perishable materials, they're hard to document. But, as seen in earlier discussions, their influence is clearly visible in Pompeian wall paintings. Despite their exaggerations and distortions, those images still provide a vivid glimpse into a lost architectural world. The next stage, actually a series of connected developments, was the transformation of this imaginative architecture into monumental public buildings, simplified and adapted for new uses. In the case of Roman theaters, this process can be traced from Scaurus's theater to the theater of Pompey. In Western Anatolia, and especially around Ephesus, the revival of large-scale construction in the early empire saw these architectural ideas reinterpreted and applied not just to stage buildings, but to any public structure where a rich columned facade could add grandeur. Even in Ephesus alone, these dramatic column arrangements were used in monumental gates, ceremonial halls in gymnasium bath complexes, the library facade, and the stage wall of the theater. The earliest gates in Ephesus were more restrained. The west gate of the agora was a simple Ionic structure, with a wide staircase leading to a columned facade flanked by 2 projecting piers. The harbor gate, while also Ionic, was slightly more complex, with a rectangular layout and a sequence of 3 openings flanked by 4 projections. By about AD 160, the West Market Gate at Miletus still followed this basic design, but had added a second level with small pediments on the sides and a large broken pediment in the center. However, the arched gateway at the southern end of the marble-paved street leading down from the theater showed a shift away from this simplicity. Its open design, clearly meant to frame statues, and the awkward proportions of its upper level, rising above the lower arch, resemble the Arch of Hadrian in Athens, though not as successfully executed. In the examples of the Ephesus theater and the library of Celsus, we see some of the clearest versions of the columned facade style that developed in Asia Minor. The library, with its elegant proportions and clean lines, stands as one of the finest examples of this type. It expresses a sense of seriousness and dignity. On the other end of the spectrum are the richly decorated marble halls in the grand bath complexes, which sometimes seem built just for show. For example, in the harbor baths of Ephesus, the main front had a tall row of columns, and the interior featured layered column arrangements on 3 walls. These were decorated with dramatic straight and curved shapes, including creatively broken pediments, all made from colorful marbles. White marble floors, statues, and ceilings made from painted or gilded wooden panels added to the luxurious effect. Yet, since much of this is only known through restorations, it is difficult to tell where tasteful decoration ends and excess begins. In some rural examples, like those inside in Pamphylia, the decoration clearly goes too far, even though the buildings were a source of local pride. Still, in the best examples, this style balances wealth with elegance and matches the spirit of its time perfectly. In Miletus, the Nymphaeum built in honor of Emperor Trajan's father is quite plain, but it is important as one of the earliest monumental examples of a type of fountain building made mostly of columned facades. These buildings were mainly built to close off a view or hide what lay behind them. In this case, the structure was used to finish the monumental front of the square opposite the Bouleuterion and the west gate of the Agora. The design was purely visual and had no functional connection with what was behind it. These theatrical-style facades became common in small towns of southern Anatolia and became a sign of civic pride, just like having a colonnaded street. Outside Anatolia, they are rare. One example is the Septizodium in Rome, built to hide service buildings on the south slope of the Palatine Hill. Another is the so-called captives facade in Corinth, used to close an unattractive gate. Although the cities of southern Asia Minor, like Pamphylia and Cilicia, have many Roman buildings, their architectural importance is not as high as the cities along the western coast and valleys. Development in these areas began later and was largely imitative. The region suffered badly during the civil wars of the late Republic and only started to recover in the time of Augustus and his successors. Classical Hellenistic culture had never been strong here, and most of the early buildings were constructed during the 2nd century BC under the control of Pergamon. Good examples of this early building tradition include the well-preserved city walls of Antalya, Attaleia, and Perge, and the 2-story stoa next to the Agora in Aspendos. These buildings were based on a local style that focused on finely cut stonework, which remained the basis for construction throughout antiquity. Roman architecture later built on this foundation. Pamphylian Roman architecture can be divided into 2 main phases. The first lasted from the time of Augustus to Trajan, 27 BC, AD 117. Materials during this period were local, and influences were mixed. A small 4-column pseudo-peripteral temple inside was made of limestone and stood on a podium. In terms of layout, it resembles the Temple of Augustus at Pisidian Antioch. Another example is a large circular tomb built on a square base overlooking the port of Antalya. A small fountain building from AD 71 inside, although modest in size, retains a fully Hellenistic decorative style and seems like a simpler version of the large Nymphia in Ephesus and Miletus. Perge's impressive south gate, probably from the Augustan period, also keeps the Hellenistic style. By the 120s AD, this Roman Pamphylian tradition was quickly replaced by a new style dominated by marble. Most of the marble used in Pamphylia came from the Proconnesos quarries on the island of Marmara, and the architectural styles and techniques were the same as those in Western Asia Minor. Inside, this change is visible in a smaller temple facing the harbor, probably from Hadrian's reign, which had 6 columns and decorative features borrowed directly from the Trajaneum in Pergamon. A larger temple built a few decades later had composite capitals and similar plans. Both resemble the temple of Antoninus Pius in Sagalassos, about 100 kilometers inland. This shows that the Imperial marble style was not only widespread in Pamphylia, but also common across many Mediterranean provinces. By the mid-2nd century, this style had become dominant in Pamphylian monumental architecture. Inside, examples include 3 colonnaded streets, a city gate modeled after Perge's South Gate, a large nymphaeum facing it, a theater with decorative motifs like those at the Trajaneum, a square piazza behind the stage building, used for business and surrounded by small shops like the Forum of Corporations in Ostia, a large columned courtyard with an elaborate marble hall from the late 2nd century, a small 3rd century temple with a semicircular cella and an arched entrance, a small circular temple with a conical roof dedicated to the goddess Tyche, and a grand mausoleum, possibly from the early 4th century. Except for the cavea of the theater, most of these structures were completely new. They reflect both the visual strength of this architectural style and the social stability that allowed middle-class urban wealth to support its spread. Other cities in Pamphylia followed the same pattern. In Perge, the transformation of the South Gate into a nymphaeum included 2 levels of rich marble decoration along its curved inner walls and a monumental triple arch opening toward the colonnaded street to the north. Thanks to inscriptions and statues, this project can be dated between A.D. 117 and 122. A similar nymphaeum was built at the other end of the street a few years later. Both used marble and fine white limestone from the Pisidian Mountains. Although limestone would soon be replaced by marble for decorative details, it continued to be used in walls and vaults. In Perge, as inside, it remained the main building material for the large Roman theater, the vaulted stadium, the Macellum, a circular central market building in the southern Italian style, and 2 well-preserved public baths. These bathhouses are especially notable for their rectangular rooms and the clear traces of brick vaulting still visible. The political history of Rome's eastern frontier is mainly about a long rivalry with the rulers of Iran. This sometimes turned into open war, but often remained a tense competition. In the mid-2nd century BCE, the Parthian Empire emerged as a powerful local force. It developed from a national reaction against the Seleucid kingdom, which had both Greek and Iranian roots. The Parthians controlled a huge region stretching from the bend of the Euphrates River all the way to the Indus Valley, where the Kushan kingdom lay. This was the only part of the Roman Empire's vast borders where it faced a powerful and civilized rival. Both the Parthian Empire, around 240 BCE to 226 CE, and its successor, the Sasanian Empire, from 226 CE onward, went through periods of strength and weakness. This led to an unstable balance between Rome and Iran. However, major wars were rare. Most of the time, the 2 empires tried to coexist peacefully. Their border became not only a line of separation, but also a zone of cultural exchange and profitable trade. Several semi-independent buffer states helped manage this balance. Kingdoms like Armenia, Cilicia, Commagene, Emesa, Hatra, Judea, Nabatea, Osroene, Palmyra, and Pontus often shifted their loyalty between Rome and the Parthians. These small frontier states were generally only able to act independently under exceptionally strong rulers. Most of the time, they eventually fell under Roman or Parthian control. But their real importance lay in the fields of thought, religion, and art. They were heirs to civilizations much older than either Rome or Parthia. And while borders shifted, these regions shared a common culture, religion, and trade network. For example, a citizen of Dura or Palmyra in the 3rd century would have felt more at home in Parthian Hatra than in Rome. These cities were not just border towns. They were cultural centers that influenced both East and West. This area officially became part of the Roman world in 64 BCE, after Pompey conquered the remains of the Seleucid Empire. While the administrative organization of the Roman province of Syria, including Judea and Arabia, is not the main focus here. The geography of the region matters more. Central and southern Syria could be divided into 3 parts: a narrow coastal strip facing west, a broad and changeable frontier zone stretching toward the desert, and a mountainous middle zone that included modern-day Lebanon and parts of Palestine. In these mountains, the Bekaa Valley between the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon ranges became a key route for desert trade caravans moving between Damascus, Sidon, and Tyre, and even further toward Palmyra. Another major route passed north through Emesa, modern Homs. Palestine, like Lebanon, often turned westward or remained inward-looking. It did not connect much with the poorer frontier areas to the east, like Nabatea and the Decapolis cities beyond the Jordan. Instead, its natural connection was to the north, through Damascus. In the northern part of the Syrian coast, in today's Syria, there was a wealthy inland area that opened both westward and eastward. Here, the Euphrates River ran just 100 miles from the Mediterranean. From this region, a major trade route crossed diagonally toward Seleucia on the Tigris, near modern Baghdad, and the Persian Gulf. Because of this strategic location, Seleucus IV founded a new capital, Antioch, around 300 BCE. Later, it became the Roman administrative center in Syria. Antioch was not only the capital of Roman Syria, but also a major commercial and cultural hub, and later a religious center for early Christianity. Alongside its nearby sister cities, Apamea, Laodicea, and the port of Seleucia, Antioch was the main center of Hellenism in Syria. The loss of its monuments is a major gap in ancient history, comparable to the loss of Alexandria in Egypt. The lost cities of Antioch and Seleucia on the Tigris can be partially understood through the remains at Dura. This town, on the banks of the Euphrates, served as a Greek, Parthian, and Roman military post. Like Hatra, which was briefly under Roman control, Dura was on the eastern edge of the Roman world and represents the contested frontier zone. These towns were not fully Roman or fully Persian, but rather culturally mixed and dynamic. Also notable are the rural classical buildings in northern Syria's Jebel region between Antioch and Aleppo, dating from the later periods. Further north and northeast, a road followed the upper Tigris River through Edessa and Nisibis, but little is known about Roman architecture in that area. East of the Mesopotamian frontier lay vast lands that Roman writers called simply Parthia, though the cultural and political reality was far more diverse.